Hey guys, tonight we're traveling to ancient Egypt to meet perhaps the most misunderstood woman in history, Cleopatra. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you were asked to describe Cleopatra using only one word, there's a good chance that word would be beautiful. Not queen, not scholar, not polyglot, not one of antiquity's most capable political survivors. Just beautiful. For more than 2,000 years, Cleopatra has been introduced as history's ultimate femme fatale, a woman so breathtakingly attractive that the most powerful men in Rome supposedly forgot how to govern the largest republic on earth the moment she smiled in their direction. According to popular culture, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, conquered Gaul, survived countless battles, and outmaneuvered every rival imaginable. But one look at Cleopatra, and suddenly his strategic thinking packed its bags and went on holiday. It's a wonderfully dramatic story. It also gives Roman politicians remarkably little credit. They may have been ambitious, ruthless, and occasionally willing to start a civil war over a disagreement, but they generally weren't complete idiots. The Cleopatra, most people imagine today, is actually the product of centuries of imagination. Renaissance painters gave her the face of an Italian noblewoman. Victorian artists somehow made her look like she'd just stepped out of a luxury perfume advertisement. Hollywood, naturally, recruited some of the most beautiful actresses in the world to play her. At that point, the historical Cleopatra never really stood a chance. After enough paintings, plays, novels, television shows, documentaries, and blockbuster films, the legend became stronger than the evidence. The funny part is that the ancient writers, the people closest to Cleopatra's lifetime, don't spend nearly as much time admiring her looks as modern audiences do. One of our most valuable sources is the Greek historian Plutarch, writing roughly a century after Cleopatra's death. If anyone had the perfect opportunity to tell readers she was unimaginably beautiful, it was him. Instead, he basically says, not exactly. Plutarch explains that her beauty was not incomparable or immediately astonishing. That sentence has probably disappointed generations of Hollywood casting directors. Rather than describing a woman whose appearance alone overwhelmed everyone around her, Plutarch says her real power came from something much harder to paint on a canvas. Her conversation, her intelligence, her confidence, the charm in her voice, the way she spoke, the way she made people feel when they were around her. In other words, Cleopatra mastered what today we'd probably call charisma. And unlike expensive jewellery, charisma unfortunately cannot be displayed in a museum glass case with a helpful little information plaque. Imagine attending a dinner party where one guest quietly becomes the centre of every conversation. They aren't necessarily the most attractive person in the room, yet somehow everyone gradually turns toward them. They remember names. They ask clever questions. They know exactly when to make a joke, when to flatter someone, and when to simply listen. Hours later, that's the person everyone remembers. That appears to have been Cleopatra. She spoke numerous languages fluently, allowing her to communicate directly with foreign rulers and ambassadors without interpreters. In the ancient world, this was surprisingly unusual. Most monarchs relied on translators, which is an excellent way to accidentally declare war, because someone misunderstood the word for tribute. Cleopatra preferred avoiding those sorts of misunderstandings. She studied philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, economics, rhetoric, and literature in Alexandria, home to the greatest library in the ancient world. While other royal children were learning how to sit elegantly during ceremonies, Cleopatra was busy learning how kingdoms actually functioned. That turned out to be the far more useful hobby. Yet somewhere along the way, those accomplishments were quietly pushed into the background. The main reason was politics. After Cleopatra's death, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, needed to justify why Rome had fought one final civil war. Saying, "I defeated an exceptionally intelligent foreign queen who nearly outplayed us all," wasn't nearly as convenient as saying, "Rome was rescued from a dangerous seductress who bewitched honourable Roman men." It was brilliant propaganda, and like much successful propaganda, people kept repeating it long after everyone involved had died. Poets embraced it, playwrights expanded it, painters embroidered it, Hollywood wrapped it in gold jewellery, dramatic music, and enough eyeliner to empty an entire cosmetics store. By then, the myth had become almost impossible to separate from the woman. So tonight, we're going to attempt something rather unusual. We're going to meet Cleopatra before 2,000 years of storytelling gave her the world's most famous makeover. Because the real Cleopatra wasn't extraordinary simply because she may have been attractive. She was extraordinary because she ruled one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean while surrounded by assassins, rival siblings, ambitious Roman generals, collapsing alliances, and enough political backstabbing to make a porcupine feel uncomfortable. And somehow, against all reasonable expectations, she kept winning. Before Cleopatra ever met Julius Caesar, before she sailed up the Nile with Mark Antony, and long before Roman propaganda transformed her into history's most famous temptress, she had already survived something most people would politely decline: her own family. Now every family has disagreements. Some argue about money, others argue about politics. A few brave souls even argue over who forgot to buy bread. The Ptolemies, however, preferred a more direct approach. They argued with poison, or armies, or the occasional assassination. To understand Cleopatra, you first have to understand the remarkable collection of relatives she inherited. Her family belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded nearly 3 centuries earlier by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. When Alexander died in 323 before Christ without a clear adult heir, his empire immediately fell apart. His generals divided the territories between themselves, and Ptolemy claimed Egypt. It was an excellent choice. Egypt possessed fertile farmland, immense wealth, busy trade routes, and the dependable Nile River, which politely arrived every year with fresh water instead of unpleasant surprises. Compared with many neighbouring kingdoms, it was practically ancient real estate with waterfront views. The Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria, a city that quickly became one of the greatest centres of learning in the ancient world. They spoke Greek, governed like Macedonian monarchs, and proudly traced their ancestry back to Alexander's companions. Interestingly, despite ruling Egypt for generations, they rarely bothered learning the Egyptian language. That would eventually make Cleopatra rather unusual. But the dynasty also developed another tradition, one that modern family therapists would probably describe as deeply concerning. To preserve what they believed was the purity of the royal bloodline, brothers frequently married sisters, uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins. Family trees began looking less like trees and more like circles that had simply given up trying. These marriages weren't based on romance. They were political arrangements designed to keep power concentrated within the royal household. Unfortunately, they also concentrated something else: rivalry. Every royal child grew up knowing that brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, uncles, and cousins could all become competitors for the throne. Trust was a luxury very few could afford. Cleopatra herself was born around 69 before Christ, the daughter of King Ptolemy XII, a ruler whose greatest talent seemed to be paying Rome enormous amounts of money in exchange for staying king a little longer. Roman politicians happily accepted these payments, proving once again that accepting other people's money is an ancient profession. When Cleopatra was still young, her father was driven from Egypt by a popular uprising. For several years he lived in exile under Roman protection while trying to convince influential senators to restore him to power. Eventually, they did, not out of kindness, of course. There was considerable profit to be made. Watching all of this unfold taught Cleopatra an unforgettable lesson before she was even an adult. power was rarely inherited safely. It had to be negotiated, purchased, defended, and, when necessary, fought for. By the time she reached adulthood, she had learned something few princesses ever wished to master. In her family, surviving was often a greater achievement than simply being born royal. While most royal children spent their youth learning how to smile politely during ceremonies and avoid spilling wine on expensive robes, Cleopatra was preparing for a very different future. She was preparing to rule. That may sound perfectly normal for a princess. After all, royal families usually educate their children to become future monarchs. The Ptolemies, however, had a slightly different educational philosophy. They educated all their children because no one knew which one would still be alive in 10 years. Growing up in Alexandria offered Cleopatra an advantage that few rulers in history ever enjoyed. She lived in one of the greatest intellectual capitals the world had ever seen. Founded by Alexander the Great and expanded under the Ptolemies, Alexandria wasn't simply another large city. It was the Silicon Valley, Oxford, and New York of the ancient Mediterranean rolled into one, except with considerably more marble and significantly fewer coffee shops. Scholars travelled from Greece, Egypt, Persia, India, and beyond to exchange ideas. Ships entering the harbour often had their books copied for the famous Library of Alexandria before they were allowed to continue their journeys. Imagine arriving at customs today and being told, "Thank you for visiting. We'll just borrow your laptop for a few weeks." The library itself became legendary, containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls covering nearly every subject imaginable. Philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, geography, engineering, poetry, and history all found a home within its walls. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by that world. Although historians cannot list every lesson she received, the ancient sources consistently describe her as exceptionally well educated. She studied rhetoric, allowing her to persuade audiences with carefully chosen words. She learned philosophy, which taught rulers how to reason through difficult decisions rather than simply reacting to them. Mathematics and astronomy helped her understand taxation, calendars, navigation, and agriculture. Medicine fascinated her enough that later writers claimed she conducted research into herbs and remedies, though some stories are undoubtedly exaggerated. She also became an accomplished reader of literature and history. That mattered more than it might seem. History, after all, was the instruction manual for surviving politics. Every successful ruler before her became another case study. Every failed ruler became a warning. Unlike modern students, Cleopatra couldn't simply search "How not to lose your kingdom" and receive a helpful list of articles. She had to read several centuries of expensive scrolls instead. One subject, however, became her greatest strength: languages. Most members of the Ptolemaic dynasty spoke Greek and relied heavily on interpreters whenever they dealt with foreign peoples. Cleopatra took a different approach entirely. According to ancient writers, she spoke numerous languages fluently. Greek remained her native tongue, but she also learned Egyptian, the language previous Ptolemaic rulers had largely ignored, as well as several neighbouring languages used by diplomats and merchants throughout the eastern Mediterranean. This gave her a remarkable advantage. She could greet ambassadors in their own language. She could negotiate directly without waiting for translators. She could hear subtle changes in tone, hesitation, or confidence that often disappeared during interpretation. Anyone who has watched an awkward conversation slowly unravel through 3 different translators can appreciate how valuable that was. Words carry more than meaning. They carry emotion. They build trust. Cleopatra understood that better than almost anyone. Long before she ever became queen, she had discovered a truth that many rulers never learned. Knowledge wasn't merely something impressive to possess. In dangerous times, it could become the most powerful weapon in an entire kingdom. By the time Cleopatra reached her late teens, she possessed an excellent education, spoke multiple languages, understood diplomacy better than many seasoned politicians, and had grown up watching palace intrigue unfold almost daily. Unfortunately, none of those qualifications guaranteed the one thing she actually needed: the throne. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 before Christ, his will attempted to solve the succession problem in the traditional Ptolemaic fashion. Cleopatra, around 18 years old, would rule alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only about 10 years old. There was one additional detail. According to royal custom, they were expected to marry. To modern ears, this sounds deeply unsettling. To the Ptolemies, it was simply Tuesday. The marriage wasn't intended to create a happy family life. It existed to keep the royal bloodline pure and to prevent outsiders from claiming the throne through marriage. History, however, repeatedly demonstrated that marrying your sibling does surprisingly little to reduce family arguments. Almost immediately, cracks began to appear. Although Cleopatra was officially co-ruler, she clearly intended to govern in her own right. Early official documents listed only her name. Coins were minted bearing her image. She appeared before officials independently and signed decrees without emphasizing her young brother's authority. This did not please the people surrounding the boy king. Because Ptolemy was still a child, real power rested in the hands of his advisors. 3 men became particularly influential: the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetorician Theodotus. Together they realized that an intelligent, ambitious young queen was considerably harder to manipulate than a 10-year-old boy. Their solution was simple: remove Cleopatra. Court politics quickly became poisonous. Supporters chose sides, accusations spread through Alexandria, and before long Cleopatra found herself losing control of the government she had barely begun to rule. Eventually, she was forced to flee Egypt altogether. Imagine spending your entire childhood preparing to become queen, only to discover that within a couple of years you've been chased into exile by your little brother's advisors. Family reunions were unlikely to improve from that point onward. Cleopatra escaped eastward into Syria, where many rulers might have accepted defeat and quietly lived out the rest of their lives in comfortable obscurity. She had other ideas. Instead of surrendering, she began raising an army. This decision tells us something important about her character. Cleopatra wasn't waiting for someone to rescue her. She wasn't writing emotional letters, asking relatives to reconsider. She wasn't hoping the palace would suddenly apologize for the misunderstanding. She was preparing to march back and reclaim her kingdom. Meanwhile, Egypt drifted toward chaos. 2 rival governments now claimed legitimacy. Cleopatra gathered forces outside the country, while Ptolemy XIII remained in Alexandria under the guidance of his advisors. Civil war seemed increasingly inevitable. Then, quite unexpectedly, events in Rome transformed everything. Across the Mediterranean, Julius Caesar had just defeated his rival Pompey in another brutal Roman civil war. Pompey fled across the sea seeking refuge in Egypt, believing the young king would honour old alliances. Instead, the king's advisors made what they believed was a brilliant political calculation. They murdered Pompey before Caesar even arrived. It was meant as a gift. It would prove to be one of the greatest diplomatic miscalculations in ancient history. And for Cleopatra, it presented the opportunity she had been waiting for. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 before Christ, he probably expected a short diplomatic visit. Instead, he walked directly into one of the most complicated family disputes in ancient history. Rome had just endured years of civil war. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, defeated rival armies across Greece, Italy and Spain, and finally chased his greatest opponent, Pompey the Great, all the way to Egypt. Pompey believed Egypt would welcome him. After all, Cleopatra's father had owed much of his throne to Roman support, and Pompey himself had helped restore the Ptolemaic king years earlier. Surely Egypt would reward old friends. Instead, the advisors surrounding young Ptolemy XIII decided to impress Caesar by murdering Pompey before he even reached shore. The plan sounded clever during the meeting. It sounded considerably less clever once Caesar actually arrived. According to ancient historians, Caesar was presented with Pompey's severed head as a diplomatic gift. Rather than thanking them, he was horrified. Pompey had been his political rival, certainly, but he had also once been his ally, his son-in-law, and one of Rome's greatest generals. Romans admired victory, but they also respected dignity. Executing a defeated guest who had come seeking protection did not exactly scream trustworthy allies. The advisors had hoped to earn Caesar's gratitude. Instead, they earned his suspicion. Suddenly, Caesar found himself in the middle of Egypt's succession crisis. Two rulers claimed the throne. One was the young king controlled by ambitious advisors. The other was an exiled queen gathering supporters just beyond Egypt's borders. Cleopatra immediately recognized something that many politicians fail to notice. Moments of chaos often create opportunities. She knew that simply marching into Alexandria with an army would likely fail. Caesar already occupied the city with his veterans. If she appeared as another invading force, she risked making herself look like the aggressor. She needed something far more powerful, a private conversation. Getting one, however, was easier imagined than accomplished. The royal palace was firmly controlled by her brother's supporters. Guards watched every entrance, and anyone openly loyal to Cleopatra risked immediate arrest. Walking through the front gate while announcing, "Good evening, I'd like to discuss the throne with Julius Caesar," was unlikely to produce favourable results. So Cleopatra chose a far more memorable entrance. Ancient writers tell us that she secretly entered Alexandria under cover of darkness. Her loyal servant, Apollodorus of Sicily, smuggled her into the palace concealed inside a large bundle of bedding or a linen sack. Over the centuries, this gradually evolved into the famous story that she emerged from a rolled-up carpet. It is one of history's most enduring images. Whether it was actually a carpet, a rug, or simply a large sack of fabric remains uncertain. The important detail isn't the furniture. It's the strategy. Rather than relying on beauty, wealth, or military force, Cleopatra relied on surprise, courage, and impeccable timing. She placed herself directly before the most powerful man in the Roman world before anyone else had the chance to influence him. Imagine Caesar's evening. One moment you're reviewing documents about Egyptian politics. The next, someone unrolls what appears to be expensive laundry, and out climbs the exiled queen you've been hearing about for days. It's certainly one way to guarantee the meeting won't be forgotten. More importantly, it gave Cleopatra exactly what she wanted. Not romance, not immediate victory, something far more valuable. The chance to speak for herself before anyone else could tell her story. By the time Cleopatra finished her first private meeting with Julius Caesar, very little had actually changed. She wasn't queen again. Her brother still occupied the palace. The Egyptian court still wanted her gone. And Caesar still commanded fewer than 4,000 Roman soldiers inside a city whose population greatly outnumbered him. Yet everything had changed, because Caesar had now heard both sides of the story. For years, countless books, films, and television series have suggested that Cleopatra won Caesar over through irresistible beauty alone. It's certainly a romantic explanation. It also ignores one rather inconvenient fact. Julius Caesar was 52 years old. He had spent more than 3 decades navigating Roman politics, defeating rival generals, surviving assassination attempts, suppressing rebellions, and outmaneuvering some of the sharpest minds of his generation. This was a man who had negotiated with tribal chiefs, senators, kings, pirates, and political enemies before breakfast. He was not easily manipulated. If simply being attractive were enough to control Julius Caesar, Rome would have collapsed much earlier. Instead, Caesar saw something much more valuable. He saw competence. Cleopatra arrived prepared. She knew Egypt's political situation better than anyone. She explained how her father's will had legally named both siblings as joint rulers. She exposed the influence of the advisors controlling her younger brother, and likely emphasized that she, unlike them, could offer stability. And stability was exactly what Caesar wanted. Rome depended heavily on Egyptian grain. Every year, enormous shipments crossed the Mediterranean, feeding hundreds of thousands of Romans. A stable Egypt meant a stable food supply. A A civil war in Egypt threatened both Rome's economy and Caesar's political future. Choosing between Cleopatra and the advisors wasn't simply deciding which royal sibling seemed more pleasant. It was deciding who was most likely to govern effectively. Caesar had built his career on recognizing talented people. He wasn't searching for the most beautiful queen. He was searching for the safest investment. The advisors surrounding Ptolemy XIII quickly realized that Caesar was slipping beyond their influence. That made them nervous. Very nervous. They demanded that Caesar leave Egypt. They insisted he had no authority to interfere in Egyptian affairs. Caesar calmly replied that he was merely carrying out the wishes of the late king's will, which had actually asked Rome to oversee the succession if necessary. Whether this was genuine concern for Egyptian law or remarkably convenient legal interpretation depends entirely on whom you ask. Either way, Caesar wasn't leaving. The palace atmosphere became increasingly tense. Meetings grew colder. Guards watched one another carefully. Every conversation carried political consequences. Outside the palace, supporters of both rulers gathered throughout Alexandria. Rumors spread faster than facts. One version of events would circulate in the morning, only to be replaced by an even more dramatic version before sunset. Ancient cities didn't have social media, but they certainly had gossip. In some respects, it worked even faster. Then the situation exploded. Achilles, commander of the Egyptian army and loyal to Ptolemy's advisors, marched toward Alexandria with roughly 20,000 soldiers. Caesar suddenly found himself trapped. His small Roman force occupied the royal quarter, surrounded by a hostile city and facing an army several times its size. It was no longer simply Cleopatra's struggle for the throne. It had become Caesar's struggle to survive. For Cleopatra, there was now no turning back. She had gambled everything on one Roman general. If Caesar fell, she would almost certainly fall with him. Fortunately for both of them, Julius Caesar had developed an unfortunate habit for his enemies. The more impossible the situation appeared, the more dangerous he tended to become. If Cleopatra thought that convincing Julius Caesar to support her claim would immediately place the crown back on her head, the next few months were a rather unpleasant reminder that politics rarely works that efficiently. Winning an ally and winning a kingdom were two very different things. The moment Caesar declared that he intended to settle the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother, Alexandria erupted into chaos. Ptolemy XIII's advisors had already lost the political battle inside the palace. They intended to win the military one outside it. Achilles, commander of the Egyptian army, marched on Alexandria with tens of thousands of soldiers. Caesar, meanwhile, had fewer than 4,000 legionaries. Those are not odds most military commanders would voluntarily choose. Fortunately for Caesar, voluntarily choosing sensible odds had never really been one of his hobbies. Rather than abandoning the palace, he fortified the royal quarter. His soldiers secured key buildings, blocked streets, and established defensive positions overlooking the harbour. Every wall became a fortress, every doorway a checkpoint, and every rooftop suddenly seemed like an excellent place for someone carrying a spear. On the morning of the 15th of March, 44 before Christ, Cleopatra was still in Rome. She had every reason to believe the future looked promising. Egypt was stable. Her throne was secure. Her relationship with Julius Caesar had elevated her kingdom to a position of enormous importance. Rome and Egypt were cooperating more closely than they had in generations, and her young son, Caesarion, represented what she hoped would become a lasting bond between the two powers. Then, within a matter of minutes, everything unravelled. Caesar entered the theatre of Pompey to attend a meeting of the Senate. Ironically, the building was named after Pompey the Great, the very rival Caesar had defeated only a few years earlier. History occasionally enjoys arranging these little coincidences, as if it were trying a bit too hard to impress future historians. As Caesar took his seat, a group of senators surrounded him. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary petition. Then one senator grabbed his toga, another drew a dagger, Within moments, dozens of blades flashed through the crowd. Ancient sources tell us Caesar was stabbed 23 times. Whether every wound landed or not is still debated, but one fact is certain. The most powerful man in the Roman world lay dead before the Senate meeting had truly begun. The assassins believed they had saved the Roman Republic. Instead, they guaranteed years of civil war. News spread across Rome with astonishing speed. Markets emptied, doors slammed shut. Crowds gathered in confusion. No one knew what would happen next. Whenever the most powerful politician in the country is suddenly murdered, people generally become reluctant to make long-term dinner plans. For Cleopatra, the danger was immediate. She was not merely a foreign visitor. She was Caesar's closest royal ally. She had lived in Rome under his protection. Many Romans believed, correctly or not, that she had considerable influence over him. If angry crowds wanted someone else to blame for Caesar's growing ambition, an Egyptian queen made a very convenient target. There is no evidence that Cleopatra had any knowledge of the assassination beforehand, nor did she play any role in Roman politics beyond protecting Egypt's interests. But in times of chaos, facts often travel much more slowly than rumours. She acted quickly. Rather than becoming involved in Rome's unfolding power struggle, Cleopatra quietly prepared to leave the city. She gathered her household, her advisors, her young brother Ptolemy XIV, and her son Caesarion. Within days, she was sailing back toward Alexandria. It was probably the wisest decision she could have made. Behind her, Rome descended into uncertainty. Mark Antony attempted to seize control. The assassins hoped to restore the Republic. A young man named Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, barely 18 years old, returned to Italy to claim his inheritance. At the time, few people considered Octavian the most dangerous figure in Roman politics. He seemed inexperienced, physically unimpressive, and far younger than his rivals. History has repeatedly demonstrated that underestimating quiet young politicians is rarely an excellent career choice. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra faced another difficult challenge. Caesar, the man whose support had secured her throne, was gone. Everything she had built over the past 4 years suddenly rested on uncertain foundations. Even more importantly, Caesar had left behind no official recognition of Caesarion as his heir. Instead, his will named Octavian as his adopted son. That single document changed the future of Rome, and although Cleopatra could not yet know it, it had also begun the countdown to the greatest conflict of her entire reign. After Julius Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra did something that often goes unnoticed. She waited. That might not sound particularly exciting, but in politics, knowing when not to act can be every bit as important as knowing when to charge into battle. While Rome tore itself apart once again, Cleopatra focused on strengthening Egypt. Taxes were collected, trade resumed, grain exports continued, and Alexandria remained one of the wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean. She understood something many ambitious rulers forget. Civil wars eventually end. The survivors remember who stayed useful. Over the next few years, Rome descended into yet another struggle for power. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted general, joined forces with the young Octavian and Marcus Lepidus to form what historians call the Second Triumvirate. Together, they hunted down Caesar's assassins, defeating Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi. With their enemies gone, the victors divided the Roman world between themselves. Octavian took the west, Antony governed the east, and the east happened to include Egypt. Soon enough, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey. Officially, he wanted answers. During Rome's recent conflicts, Cleopatra had remained carefully neutral, though she had provided limited support where it best protected Egypt's interests. Antony wanted to know exactly where her loyalties lay. Many people imagine Cleopatra nervously preparing to defend herself. Instead, she prepared a performance. Not because she intended to seduce Antony, because she intended to impress him. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra sailed into Tarsus aboard an extraordinary royal barge. Purple sails caught the wind, silver oars flashed in the sunlight, musicians played softly across the water, and fragrant incense drifted through the air. Servants dressed as mythical figures surrounded the queen while she herself appeared as the goddess Aphrodite. It sounds almost theatrical. That was precisely the point. Cleopatra understood symbolism better than almost anyone alive. She wasn't introducing herself as another nervous client, begging Rome for protection. She was reminding Antony that Egypt was ancient, wealthy, sophisticated, and unlike any other kingdom under Roman influence. In modern terms, she wasn't attending the meeting. She was hosting it. Even though Antony had issued the invitation, the effect was immediate. Plutarch writes that Antony, expecting Cleopatra to appear before his court, instead found himself accepting her invitation to dine aboard the royal ship. Somehow, within a single afternoon, the balance of the meeting had quietly shifted. That was no accident. Cleopatra had spent her entire life studying people. She understood that first impressions were political weapons. Luxury could communicate power. Confidence could reshape negotiations. And making someone curious was often more effective than trying desperately to please them. Mark Antony was captivated, not simply by Cleopatra herself, but by the world she represented. Unlike Julius Caesar, who had arrived in Egypt as a conqueror, Antony encountered a queen who already knew exactly how Roman politics worked. She was no longer the young ruler fighting to reclaim her throne. She had become an experienced monarch who had survived civil war, outlived rivals, rebuilt her kingdom, and learned one of history's greatest lessons. Power wasn't about making an entrance. It was about making sure everyone remembered it long after you had left the room. By the time Cleopatra and Mark Antony had become allies, something remarkable had happened. Cleopatra was no longer simply reacting to history, she was shaping it. The frightened young queen who had once been smuggled into Caesar's palace, wrapped in bedding, had disappeared. In her place stood a confident monarch who had ruled Egypt for nearly 2 decades, survived civil war, defeated rival siblings, negotiated with Rome's greatest leaders, and restored stability to one of the richest kingdoms in the ancient world. She had become exactly the ruler she had spent her childhood preparing to be. Yet oddly enough, this is the point where many popular retellings stop talking about her government altogether. Instead, they focus almost exclusively on romance. It's a bit like writing the biography of Winston Churchill and spending 90% of the book discussing his favourite breakfast. Interesting, perhaps, but you're probably missing the main story. While Antony spent much of his time organising Rome's eastern provinces, Cleopatra remained busy governing Egypt. The kingdom's prosperity depended on careful administration. Every year, officials measured the Nile's flooding because too little water meant poor harvests, while too much water threatened villages and farmland. Taxes had to be adjusted, grain distributed, ports supervised, merchants protected, and foreign trade encouraged. None of this makes particularly exciting Hollywood cinema. No one has ever dramatically whispered, "Quick, the annual tax assessments are ready." Yet these ordinary decisions kept Egypt wealthy. Alexandria continued to flourish as the commercial heart of the eastern Mediterranean. Ships arrived daily carrying goods from Greece, Arabia, Africa, and India. Grain, papyrus, glass, perfumes, wine, precious stones, ivory, spices, and luxury textiles flowed through its enormous harbours. Trade was the kingdom's lifeblood. Cleopatra understood that political power rested upon economic strength. A poor kingdom could not remain independent for long. A wealthy kingdom, however, became valuable to everyone. She also invested heavily in religious legitimacy. Egyptian pharaohs were not merely political rulers. They were expected to maintain harmony between humanity and the gods. Cleopatra embraced traditional Egyptian ceremonies far more enthusiastically than most of her Greek-speaking ancestors had done. She appeared publicly dressed as the goddess Isis. To modern audiences, this might sound like clever public relations. In many ways, it was. But it also reflected genuine royal tradition. Egyptian rulers had linked themselves with the gods for thousands of years before Cleopatra was born. She simply understood that respecting Egyptian customs strengthened her authority among her own people. Meanwhile, Roman visitors often found themselves impressed by something else entirely: her conversations. Ancient writers repeatedly mention that Cleopatra could speak intelligently about politics, literature, science, philosophy, and diplomacy. She possessed that rare ability to make powerful men feel they were speaking with an equal rather than simply addressing another monarch. That quality cannot easily be captured in marble, nor can it be shown on a coin, which may explain why later generations quietly ignored it. Beauty is simple to paint. Intelligence requires storytelling, and storytelling takes considerably more effort than adding another layer of gold jewellery. By now, Cleopatra had built something extraordinary. Not merely a famous romance, not merely a glamorous court, but one of the most stable and prosperous kingdoms in a Mediterranean world that seemed increasingly determined to solve every disagreement with another civil war. Unfortunately, peace rarely lasts forever. Back in Rome, a young ruler named Octavian had been watching everything very carefully, and he was already beginning to understand that defeating Mark Antony would require defeating Cleopatra first, even if only in the minds of the Roman people. By the middle of the 1st century before Christ, Cleopatra had become something rather inconvenient. She was successful. Not simply successful by Egyptian standards, but successful enough to worry Rome's most ambitious politician. His name was Octavian. The young man who had once seemed too inexperienced to compete with seasoned generals had steadily eliminated his rivals. Lepidus had been pushed aside. Antony remained powerful, but he now spent much of his time in the eastern Mediterranean alongside Cleopatra. From Octavian's perspective, this wasn't merely a political problem. It was a public relations opportunity. Modern political campaigns often rely on television interviews, newspaper headlines, carefully edited videos, and social media posts. The Romans had something arguably even more effective: rumours, poets, public speeches, coins, and an audience that absolutely loved dramatic scandals. Octavian understood that defeating Antony on the battlefield might prove difficult. Defeating his reputation, however, could begin immediately. So he launched one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. His message was remarkably simple. Mark Antony was no longer behaving like a proper Roman. He had abandoned Roman discipline. He had abandoned Roman values. Worst of all, he had fallen under the influence of a dangerous foreign queen. Notice something interesting. Octavian rarely attacked Cleopatra for being ugly. He rarely even claimed she was extraordinarily beautiful. Instead, he portrayed her as something much more frightening. A cunning, manipulative Eastern monarch who intended to dominate Rome through Antony. To Roman audiences, this struck a nerve. Rome had spent centuries celebrating its victories over foreign kings. The idea that a Roman general might serve an Egyptian queen felt humiliating. Octavian encouraged people to believe that Antony wasn't making his own decisions anymore. He was supposedly enchanted, bewitched, controlled. It was a wonderfully convenient explanation. After all, admitting that Antony had formed a deliberate political alliance with one of the Mediterranean's most capable rulers required considerably more thought. Blaming everything on one irresistible woman was much easier. Some things, it seems, never change. Meanwhile, Antony wasn't exactly helping himself. He openly spent time in Alexandria. He celebrated Egyptian ceremonies. He fathered children with Cleopatra. He granted eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children during a famous event historians call the Donations of Alexandria. To Cleopatra, these decisions strengthened her dynasty. To Octavian, they became political gold. He claimed Antony intended to divide Roman territory among foreign rulers. He suggested that Antony wished to move the centre of power from Rome to Alexandria. There was little evidence for many of these accusations. Evidence, however, is not always essential for effective propaganda. If a story confirms what people already fear, it spreads remarkably quickly. Even Antony's supporters struggled to answer every rumour. The campaign reached its peak when Octavian obtained Antony's will. Exactly how he acquired it remains controversial, since Roman wills were supposed to remain sealed until death. Nevertheless, Octavian publicly read portions of it before the Senate. According to the document, Antony wished to be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria. For many Romans, that single detail sounded almost like betrayal. A Roman hero choosing Egypt over Rome? Outrage followed almost immediately. Octavian had carefully transformed what was really another Roman civil war into something entirely different. He wasn't fighting Antony anymore. Officially, Rome was going to war against Cleopatra. It was brilliant politics. And tragically for Cleopatra, it also ensured that history would remember her not as the accomplished queen who governed Egypt for more than 20 years, but as the foreign temptress Rome claimed had bewitched one of its greatest generals. The myth was winning. The war was about to decide whether the woman behind it would survive. By the year 31 before Christ, there was no longer any realistic hope of avoiding war. The alliance between Octavian and Mark Antony had completely collapsed. Years of accusations had poisoned any chance of reconciliation, and Cleopatra found herself standing beside the one Roman leader who could still challenge Octavian's growing power. History often presents this moment as a simple love story. Antony chose Cleopatra over Rome. Rome became angry. Everyone fought. Reality, as usual, was considerably more complicated. This was a struggle over who would control the Roman world. Cleopatra understood exactly what was at stake. If Antony defeated Octavian, Egypt would almost certainly remain an independent kingdom, protected by the strongest military alliance in the Mediterranean. Her children would inherit a secure dynasty, and Alexandria could continue flourishing as one of the world's greatest cities. If Octavian won, Egypt would become a Roman possession. The Ptolemaic dynasty would almost certainly disappear, and Cleopatra herself would likely become the prize of the victor. Neither outcome left much room for compromise. During the months leading up to the final campaign, Antony and Cleopatra assembled an enormous force. Their combined fleet numbered hundreds of ships, accompanied by tens of thousands of soldiers stationed throughout Greece. It was one of the largest military operations the ancient Mediterranean had ever witnessed. On paper, their chances looked remarkably good. Reality, however, had begun quietly working against them. Antony's officers argued among themselves. Supplies became increasingly difficult to manage. Disease spread through crowded camps. Several important commanders lost confidence and defected to Octavian's side. Every week seemed to bring another unpleasant surprise. Military campaigns have a remarkable habit of refusing to follow optimistic planning meetings. Meanwhile, Octavian possessed one enormous advantage: his brilliant admiral, Marcus Agrippa. While Octavian often receives most of the credit for victory, Agrippa was arguably one of the greatest naval commanders Rome ever produced. Patient, disciplined, and relentlessly practical, he steadily captured strategic ports, disrupted Antony's supply lines, and forced his enemies into increasingly difficult positions. By the time the two fleets finally met near the Greek coast at Actium, Antony was no longer fighting on his own terms. The battle began on the 2nd of September. Unlike the dramatic naval clashes shown in films, ancient sea battles were often slow, confusing affairs. Massive warships manoeuvred awkwardly across the water, while crews struggled to ram enemy vessels or board them with infantry. Smoke from burning ships mixed with shouted orders, flying arrows, and the constant crash of wood against wood. Somewhere within this chaos, Cleopatra commanded her own Egyptian squadron. She wasn't watching comfortably from a distant palace balcony. She was present with the fleet, risking exactly the same defeat as everyone else. Then came the decision historians have debated for 2,000 years. At a crucial moment, Cleopatra's 60 ships suddenly broke through an opening in the fighting and sailed south toward Egypt. Antony saw them leaving. Without warning, he abandoned the battle and followed. To later Roman writers, this became the ultimate proof that Antony had sacrificed victory for love. Modern historians are far less certain. Some argue it was a planned withdrawal intended to preserve the treasury and remaining fleet. Others believe the battle had already been lost, making escape the only rational option. The truth remains uncertain, because the surviving accounts were largely written by authors living under Octavian's rule. What is certain is the result. The remaining fleet surrendered. Octavian had won. For Cleopatra, the consequences were immediate. The queen, who had spent more than 20 years preserving Egypt's independence, now faced the one future she had worked her entire life to prevent. Rome was coming. And this time, there would be no Julius Caesar arriving to save her. When Octavian entered Alexandria in 30 before Christ, Cleopatra already knew how the story was supposed to end. Not the version historians would eventually write. Her own story. She had ruled Egypt for more than 20 years. She had survived palace conspiracies, civil wars, exile, Roman invasions, and enough family betrayals to make future royal dynasties seem surprisingly functional by comparison. She had outlived 2 brothers, formed alliances with the 2 most powerful Romans of her age, rebuilt her kingdom, and preserved Egypt's independence longer than almost anyone thought possible. Now there was only one battle left. The battle over how she would be remembered. Mark Antony, devastated by the defeat at Actium, attempted one final defence of Alexandria. It was brave, determined, and ultimately hopeless. Octavian's forces advanced steadily toward the city, defeating what remained of Antony's army. Then disaster struck. A false rumour spread that Cleopatra had taken her own life. Upon hearing the news, Antony believed everything was lost. Rather than allowing himself to be captured, he fell upon his sword. Ancient historians tell us the attempt did not kill him immediately. Gravely wounded, he was carried to the mausoleum, where Cleopatra had locked herself inside with a handful of loyal attendants. According to Plutarch, the doors remained sealed, so Antony had to be lifted through a high window using ropes. It is one of history's most tragic scenes. The aging Roman general, who had once commanded vast armies across 3 continents, being painfully hauled into the arms of the woman he loved. He died there beside Cleopatra. With Antony gone, Octavian finally came face to face with Egypt's queen. Contrary to later legends, he treated her with considerable caution. He understood her value. If Cleopatra could be taken alive to Rome, she would become the centerpiece of his triumph, a public parade celebrating his victory before cheering crowds. Roman triumphs often displayed defeated kings and queens in chains. It was political theatre on the grandest possible scale. Octavian wanted Cleopatra alive. Cleopatra understood exactly why. She had spent enough time in Rome to know what awaited defeated rulers. She would not allow herself to become another trophy. Over the following days, Octavian attempted to reassure her. He promised fair treatment, encouraged cooperation, and tried to convince her that surrender remained her best option. Whether he genuinely intended to spare her or simply wished to prevent her suicide remains impossible to know. Cleopatra, however, made her own calculations. For perhaps the final time, she chose control over uncertainty. The exact manner of her death remains one of history's greatest mysteries. The famous story tells of an Egyptian cobra, the sacred asp, hidden inside a basket of figs. Other ancient writers suggested poison concealed in a hairpin, or a carefully prepared mixture of deadly substances. Modern historians continue debating which version is most likely. The truth disappeared with Cleopatra herself. She died at the age of 39. With her death, nearly 300 years of Ptolemaic rule came to an end. Egypt became a Roman province, and Octavian soon transformed himself into Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Yet history's final irony was only beginning. Octavian had defeated Cleopatra on the battlefield. His propaganda would defeat her for the next 2,000 years. The brilliant linguist became the beautiful queen. The accomplished administrator became the seductress. The ruler who preserved Egypt through one of antiquity's most dangerous eras became remembered mainly for her romances. And perhaps that is Cleopatra's greatest tragedy. Not that she lost her kingdom, but that one of history's most capable rulers became famous for something the ancient writers themselves rarely claimed was exceptional. Her beauty became immortal. Her brilliance deserved the same. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand why medieval people probably included autistic individuals, we first need to forget almost everything modern society associates with diagnosis. Imagine waking up in a small English village around the year 1300. There are no psychologists, no neurologists, no therapists, and certainly no online quizzes asking whether your habit of organising spoons by size means something profound. If a child behaves differently from others, nobody reaches for a medical textbook. Most villages possess exactly 0 medical textbooks, and the local healer is currently busy trying to determine whether onions can cure 3 completely unrelated illnesses. Instead, people ask different questions. Is the child blessed? Is the child unusual? Is the child destined for great things? Has God given them a special purpose? Or, depending on who is doing the talking, has a fairy stolen the real child and replaced them with another? That last explanation sounds absurd today, but it made perfect sense to many medieval people. Remember, this was an age when comets could be warnings from heaven, bad weather might signal divine displeasure, and a chicken behaving strangely could probably start a village rumour that lasted 6 months. The important thing to remember is that autism did not suddenly appear in the 20th century when doctors began describing it. Human beings have remained remarkably similar for thousands of years. The medieval world contained the same variety of minds that exist today. Some children were loud and sociable, some were quiet and withdrawn, some enjoyed festivals, crowded markets, and endless conversations. Others would probably have preferred everyone stop talking for 5 minutes, or forever. Some people developed intense interests that consumed enormous portions of their lives. One person might memorize every local family lineage. Another might spend years studying herbs. A monk might devote decades to copying manuscripts with microscopic precision. A scholar might become fascinated by a theological question so specific that even other scholars wished he would please discuss literally anything else. Medieval records are filled with people who stood out from their communities. Chroniclers wrote about individuals who avoided social interaction, preferred solitude, spoke very little, disliked certain environments, or became extraordinarily focused on particular subjects. Of course, none of this allows us to diagnose anyone. Historians cannot travel back in time, conduct assessments, and return with neatly completed paperwork. If they could, they would probably spend most of their time settling arguments at academic conferences. What we do have are descriptions, lots of descriptions. And when those descriptions are viewed through a modern lens, some begin to sound surprisingly familiar. The challenge is that medieval writers lacked the vocabulary we possess today. They could observe behavior, but they could not categorize it using modern medical language. Instead, they described what they saw: the unusually quiet child, the obsessive scholar, the solitary monk, the craftsman who seemed happiest repeating the same task thousands of times. As we move deeper into the Middle Ages, we'll discover that these people appear far more often than you might expect. Hidden among kings, peasants, monks, merchants, and craftsmen are countless individuals whose lives suggest that neurological diversity is not a modern phenomenon at all. It may simply be one of the oldest human stories ever told. If you were an autistic child growing up in a medieval village, nobody would know it, not because your behavior would go unnoticed. Quite the opposite. Medieval communities were small, close-knit places where everyone knew everyone else's business. If you sneezed unusually, there was a reasonable chance 3 neighbours would discuss it before sunset. Privacy was not a medieval strength. Most villages contained only a few hundred people at most. Families lived close together, worked together, worshipped together, and often spent their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. In such an environment, differences stood out quickly. A child who preferred solitude would be noticed. A child who spoke less than others would be noticed. A child who became intensely interested in a particular subject would definitely be noticed, especially if that subject happened to be something unusual. Imagine a boy who spends every spare moment watching birds instead of playing games with other children. He learns their migration patterns, nesting habits, and feeding behaviours. Years pass, and he still finds birds more interesting than most conversations. Today, some parents might wonder whether their child is neurodivergent. In the Middle Ages, people would probably conclude that he was simply the bird boy. And honestly, medieval nicknames were often far less flattering. Likewise, imagine a girl fascinated by weaving patterns. While other children run through fields chasing each other, she spends hours studying cloth, counting threads, and memorizing designs. Adults might see her as unusually gifted, unusually strange, or both simultaneously. The Middle Ages were surprisingly comfortable with that contradiction. A person could be admired and considered odd at exactly the same time. Many medieval children never attended school, which meant they were not constantly compared against standardized expectations. There were no report cards, no developmental checklists, and no teachers writing notes home about classroom participation. This could sometimes be an advantage. A child who struggled socially but excelled at practical skills might simply be directed toward an occupation that suited them. Medieval society cared far more about whether you could contribute than whether you fit neatly into a behavioral category. Of course, this was not always kind. Children who seemed different could face teasing, exclusion, or suspicion. Human beings have unfortunately remained remarkably consistent in their ability to notice anyone who does not perfectly match the group. Some things never change. Yet medieval communities could also be surprisingly accepting when someone's differences came with useful talents, And that brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval life. A world where unusual minds sometimes found unexpected places to thrive. For a medieval person, religion was not something you did once a week. Religion was the framework through which almost everything was understood. The seasons, illnesses, wars, harvests, dreams, strange behaviour, and unexpected events all fit into a universe governed by God. If someone acted differently from everyone else, the first explanation was rarely medical. It was spiritual. This created a fascinating situation for people who might today be recognised as autistic. Imagine a young man who dislikes crowded gatherings. He avoids village festivals, struggles with small talk, and prefers spending hours alone reading scripture or contemplating religious questions. In a modern setting, some people might see social difficulties. In the Middle Ages, others might see holiness. After all, many respected saints were not exactly known for their sparkling conversational skills. Throughout medieval Europe, stories circulated about holy men and women who preferred solitude, spoke very little, and devoted themselves obsessively to prayer. Some withdrew from society almost entirely. Others spent years focusing on a single spiritual pursuit with remarkable intensity. To medieval observers, such behaviour could appear admirable rather than unusual. A monk who spent 10 hours a day studying sacred texts was disciplined. A saint who isolated himself in the wilderness was devoted. A hermit who avoided social gatherings was spiritually focused. Nobody was asking whether these individuals experienced social interactions differently. They were asking whether God had chosen them for a special purpose. Of course, not every difference received such positive interpretations. The medieval world could be generous one moment and deeply suspicious the next. If a person's unusual behaviour fit accepted religious expectations, they might be praised. If it did not, people became nervous. A woman who spent hours speaking about visions might be regarded as blessed or dangerous. Sometimes the difference between those two judgments depended entirely on who happened to be listening. Medieval society had a remarkable talent for reaching completely opposite conclusions using the same evidence. This uncertainty meant that people who behaved differently often lived in a complicated social space. They might be respected by some neighbours and viewed with concern by others. Yet, religion also provided something modern observers sometimes overlook. It gave unusual individuals a role. A person who seemed different could become a monk, a nun, a hermit, a scholar, or a religious devotee. Their intense focus, preference for routine, and comfort with solitude could actually fit certain religious lifestyles remarkably well. And nowhere was this more obvious than inside the monasteries of medieval Europe, where some men spent entire lifetimes pursuing a single passion with a level of concentration that would leave most modern office workers exhausted before lunchtime. For most medieval children, life was centred around one institution above all others: the family. Not school, not government, not social services, certainly not a team of specialists holding meetings about developmental milestones. The family was responsible for nearly everything: food, shelter, education, discipline, work training, and survival all happened under the same roof, assuming your roof wasn't currently leaking, which in medieval Europe was often an optimistic assumption. This meant that a child who behaved differently was usually understood first and foremost by their relatives. Parents quickly learned which children enjoyed company and which preferred solitude. They learned which children followed routines with almost military precision, and which ones seemed incapable of finding their shoes 2 days in a row. Some children spoke constantly, others barely spoke at all. Most families adapted as best they could. Contrary to popular stereotypes, medieval parents generally cared deeply about their children. Life was harsh, but affection was not absent. Surviving letters, household records, and personal accounts reveal parents worrying, grieving, teaching, encouraging, and sometimes becoming utterly confused by their offspring. In other words, they were parents. Imagine a boy who becomes distressed whenever his daily routine changes. He wants meals at predictable times. He performs chores in the same order every day. He dislikes unexpected visitors. When travelers arrive without warning, everyone else is excited to hear news from distant lands. The boy is mainly annoyed because somebody is sitting in his usual spot. His family might never understand exactly why he reacts this way, but they would notice. Over time, they would often make adjustments. Many medieval households were practical rather than theoretical. They cared less about explaining behavior and more about managing it. If something worked, they kept doing it. If allowing a child to complete chores in a certain order prevented arguments, that became the routine. No lengthy debate required. Meanwhile, children with intense interests could sometimes become valuable family assets. A child fascinated by animals might become skilled with livestock. A child obsessed with counting and record-keeping might prove useful for managing accounts. A child who spent hours examining tools could eventually become a capable craftsman. The family often became the bridge between unusual traits and productive adulthood. Of course, not every family was patient or understanding. Some children undoubtedly faced criticism, punishment, or ridicule for behaviors nobody understood. But many others found something surprisingly important: acceptance. Not because people understood neurological differences, but because families often learned an eternal truth that transcends every century. When you love someone long enough, their peculiarities stop being peculiar. They simply become part of who that person is. And in medieval Europe, some of those children eventually grew into adults whose extraordinary focus would make them indispensable members of their communities. One of the biggest differences between the medieval world and the modern one was that intense interests were often not seen as hobbies. They were jobs. Today, if someone spends 8 hours researching the history of door hinges, their friends may have questions. In the Middle Ages, there was a decent chance that person eventually became the village blacksmith and made a respectable living from their unusual enthusiasm. This mattered because medieval society was built around specialization. Every community depended on people mastering highly specific skills. There were millers, masons, carpenters, scribes, weavers, armourers, bell makers, parchment makers, and countless other trades that required patience and repetition. Lots and lots of repetition. The romantic image of medieval life often involves adventure and excitement, but the reality was that many jobs consisted of performing the same task thousands of times. A stonemason might spend years carving nearly identical blocks. A blacksmith could make endless nails. A weaver might repeat the same movements hour after hour. A scribe could spend entire days copying words onto parchment. For many people, this was exhausting. For others, it may have been deeply satisfying. Imagine a young apprentice fascinated by patterns. While his friends dream of tournaments and heroic adventures, he becomes captivated by the geometry of cathedral construction. He studies arches, measurements, and stonework with relentless dedication. Years later, he might become a master builder. The villagers see expertise. Modern observers might also recognize something else: an extraordinary level of focus. Medieval records frequently mention individuals who became known for a single skill. Entire reputations were built upon mastery of one narrow area of knowledge. Some craftsmen could identify dozens of wood types by touch alone. Some scribes memorized enormous sections of religious texts. Some metalworkers spent decades perfecting techniques that outsiders barely noticed. These people were often respected precisely because of their intense interests. In fact, medieval society sometimes rewarded behavior that modern schools or workplaces might find unusual. A person who became completely absorbed in one subject could gain status, wealth, or influence if that subject happened to be useful. Of course, there were limits. If your obsession involved counting raindrops or following chickens around the village while taking notes, your career options remained somewhat restricted. Still, the broader pattern is clear. The Middle Ages created spaces where intense focus could become valuable rather than problematic. And nowhere was this more obvious than inside the monasteries, where some individuals devoted entire lifetimes to a single subject with a level of concentration that bordered on the astonishing. If there was one place in medieval Europe where an intensely focused person could thrive, it was a monastery. To modern eyes, monasteries can seem quiet, peaceful, and perhaps a little repetitive. To many medieval monks, that was not a drawback. That was the entire point. A monastery offered something increasingly rare in the chaotic medieval world: routine. The day followed a schedule. Prayers occurred at fixed hours. Meals happened at fixed times. Work had clearly defined expectations. The bells rang according to a predictable pattern. Life was structured, ordered, and remarkably consistent. For some people, this was comforting. For others, it was heaven with slightly fewer cushions. A medieval monk might wake before dawn, attend prayers, study scripture, copy manuscripts, perform assigned duties, and repeat the process day after day, year after year. To an outsider, such a life could seem monotonous. To someone who enjoyed routine and deep concentration, it could be incredibly satisfying. Monasteries were also centres of learning. Books were precious and rare, so monks often spent years studying the same texts repeatedly. Many developed astonishing memories. Some could recite enormous portions of scripture from memory. Others mastered complex theological arguments that filled entire volumes. A few became experts in subjects so specialized that even their fellow monks struggled to understand why anyone cared. History is full of scholars who spent decades arguing over details that would make modern people quietly close the book and walk away. One medieval debate concerned the exact nature of angels. Another involved intricate questions about divine knowledge and free will. These discussions could continue for years, and remarkably, participants enjoyed them. Many monks displayed a level of focus that modern observers would immediately recognize as unusual. They dedicated entire lifetimes to cataloguing information, preserving texts, and perfecting tiny details that most people overlooked. Consider the manuscript copyists. A single book could require months or even years to reproduce. Every letter had to be carefully written by hand. Every mistake mattered. Every page demanded concentration. Most people would find this unbearable after a few days. Yet some monks devoted decades to it. Their work preserved countless ancient texts that would otherwise have disappeared forever. Of course, we cannot know what was happening inside their minds, but we can observe the behavior, the preference for routine, the comfort found in predictable schedules, the intense focus on specific interests, the willingness to spend extraordinary amounts of time mastering a narrow field of knowledge. These traits appear again and again within medieval monasteries. And the more we look, the more it becomes clear that some of history's greatest preservers of knowledge may have succeeded precisely because their minds worked a little differently from everyone else's. While monks preserved knowledge inside monastery walls, craftsmen preserved something equally important outside them: skill. And medieval craftsmanship often demanded a level of precision that bordered on obsession. Consider the cathedral builders. A massive cathedral was not constructed in a few years. Some took decades. Others took more than a century. Generations of workers contributed to projects they would never live to see completed. Imagine dedicating your entire career to a building whose grand opening would be attended by your great-grandchildren. Talk about delayed gratification. Yet thousands of craftsmen did exactly that. Stonecutters spent years carving blocks to exact specifications. Carpenters shaped beams with astonishing accuracy. Glaziers assembled intricate stained glass windows composed of hundreds of tiny pieces. Every task required attention to detail. Every mistake could be expensive. And every successful project rewarded patience. Many medieval trades naturally attracted people who enjoyed systems, patterns, and repetition. A blacksmith learned how different metals behaved under specific conditions. A weaver memorized countless thread combinations. A clockmaker, later in the medieval period, worked with intricate mechanisms that required extraordinary precision. These occupations rewarded intense focus. In fact, many master craftsmen became known for their perfectionism. Some developed reputations for inspecting their own work repeatedly before allowing it to leave the workshop. Others spent far longer on projects than customers expected because they refused to accept anything less than their personal standards. This could be frustrating for everyone involved. The customer wanted the item. The craftsman wanted it to be correct. History suggests the craftsman usually won. Medieval guild records occasionally mention apprentices who struggled because they lacked patience, discipline, or attention to detail. Yet they also reveal masters who devoted enormous energy to perfecting their craft. The difference between an ordinary sword and an exceptional one might come down to tiny details invisible to most people. The same was true for furniture, textiles, manuscripts, jewellery, and architecture. Many craftsmen noticed things that others simply did not. A slightly uneven line, a minor flaw in the metal, an irregular stitch, a measurement that was off by the width of a fingernail. To most people, these imperfections barely existed. To the craftsman, they were impossible to ignore. Again, none of this proves autism. Plenty of highly skilled people are not autistic. But when historians examine medieval society, certain patterns appear repeatedly. Individuals who thrive on routine, focus intensely on specific interests, notice details others miss, and willingly dedicate years to mastering a single skill. The workshop, much like the monastery, provided an environment where those traits could become strengths rather than obstacles. And in many cases, those strengths helped build the medieval world itself. One of the most common traits associated with autism today is a preference for routine. Not everyone experiences it in the same way, of course, but many autistic people find comfort in predictability. Knowing what comes next can make the world feel more manageable, less chaotic, and far easier to navigate. As it happens, medieval society was practically built on routine. This was not because medieval people had discovered some advanced psychological insight. It was because clocks were rare, life was difficult, and nobody wanted to accidentally starve. The average peasant's year followed a pattern that changed very little from one generation to the next. Crops were planted at specific times. Harvests occurred at specific times. Religious festivals followed the church calendar. Work began at sunrise and ended when daylight disappeared. Even the seasons dictated behaviour. Spring meant planting, summer meant labour, autumn meant harvest, winter meant surviving. And then the entire process started again. Predictability was not merely comforting, it was essential. For someone who preferred structure, this environment may have felt surprisingly natural. A medieval farmer often performed the same tasks every day: feed the animals, check the fields, repair equipment, gather supplies, repeat. Tomorrow would look remarkably similar. So would next week, and probably next year. Even monasteries operated according to strict schedules. Bells announced prayers, meals, work periods, and rest. Monks could often predict exactly what they would be doing at any given hour. Frankly, some monasteries were so structured that modern corporate managers would probably take notes. This predictability helped maintain order in a world full of uncertainty, but it also meant that people who preferred routine did not necessarily stand out. Many behaviours that might seem unusual in a modern, fast-changing society blended naturally into medieval life. A person who insisted on performing tasks in the same order every day might simply be viewed as disciplined. Someone who became upset when routines changed could be seen as stubborn. Someone who carefully followed established customs might even earn respect. After all, medieval culture valued tradition. The phrase, "we've always done it this way," carried tremendous authority. Entire communities organized their lives around inherited habits. The downside, however, was that unexpected changes could be deeply disruptive. Wars, famines, plagues, and poor harvests could suddenly destroy the routines people depended upon. And for individuals who relied heavily on predictability, such disruptions may have been particularly difficult. Yet when life remained stable, medieval society offered something that many modern environments do not. A world where routine was not unusual. It was simply life. And for some people, that may have made the Middle Ages feel far less overwhelming than we often imagine. One challenge that many autistic people face today involves something most people never consciously think about: unwritten social rules. The strange thing about social rules is that nobody actually writes them down. There is no handbook, no official training course, no village elder standing in the town square announcing, "Good morning, everyone. Today's lesson is how long eye contact should last before things become uncomfortable." People are simply expected to know, and medieval society was absolutely overflowing with unwritten rules. In fact, medieval life may have contained even more social expectations than modern life. Every interaction had invisible layers. You had to know how to address a noble, how to greet a priest, how to behave at a feast, how much respect to show an elder, when to speak, when to remain silent, when to laugh, and perhaps most importantly, when not to laugh, particularly when the Lord was involved. The average peasant could probably survive a poor joke. Mocking the local lord was a considerably riskier experiment. These social customs were rarely explained in detail because most people learned them naturally through observation. Children spent years watching adults and gradually absorbed the expectations around them. But not everyone learns social behavior in exactly the same way. Medieval records occasionally describe individuals who seemed awkward, overly direct, or unaware of social conventions. Chroniclers often portrayed them as eccentric, strange, or lacking proper manners. Sometimes these descriptions sound remarkably familiar. A person speaks bluntly when diplomacy is expected. Someone becomes so focused on a topic that they continue discussing it long after everyone else has lost interest. Another individual misses subtle hints that seem obvious to others. None of these behaviors automatically indicate autism, but they do illustrate the kinds of social difficulties that have existed throughout human history. What's fascinating is that medieval society often tolerated these traits if the individual possessed valuable skills. A brilliant scholar might be forgiven for being socially awkward. A talented craftsman could be excused for being eccentric. A respected monk might be allowed certain peculiarities. People would simply shrug and say something equivalent to, "That's just how he is." Not exactly a clinical assessment, but surprisingly effective. Of course, this tolerance had limits. Someone who repeatedly violated important social expectations could find themselves isolated or criticized. The medieval world was not endlessly patient. Still, it recognized something that modern societies occasionally forget. Human beings are complicated. Some are charming, some are awkward, some effortlessly understand social situations. Others never quite figure them out, and those differences existed long before psychology gave them names. They were simply part of the rich, sometimes confusing, and often very human fabric of medieval life. If there was one medieval profession perfectly designed for a person with an intense interest in a very specific subject, it was scholarship. The medieval scholar lived in a world where knowledge was rare, books were expensive, and becoming an expert often required years of dedication, or, in some cases, decades. Imagine spending 15 years studying a single topic. Now imagine doing it without search engines, online libraries, or the ability to ask strangers on the internet for answers. Suddenly the Middle Ages begins to look less romantic and more like an endurance test. Yet some scholars thrived in exactly these conditions. Medieval universities, which began appearing across Europe from the 12th century onward, attracted individuals who were willing to devote extraordinary amounts of time to learning. Students and teachers spent years examining theology, law, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics. Many became completely absorbed in their subjects, and sometimes completely detached from everything else. Contemporary accounts occasionally describe scholars who seemed absent-minded, socially awkward, or oblivious to ordinary concerns. These men could discuss complex theological arguments for hours, while forgetting practical matters entirely. A scholar might remember hundreds of passages from ancient texts, but forget where he left his shoes. To be fair, modern academics have not entirely escaped this tradition. Some things transcend the centuries. One famous medieval stereotype involved the absent-minded professor. Students joked about teachers so immersed in thought that they appeared disconnected from the world around them. Stories circulated about scholars walking into walls, forgetting meals, or becoming lost while contemplating philosophical problems. Whether every story was true is another matter. People have always enjoyed exaggerating the eccentricities of intellectuals. Still, the stereotype existed for a reason. Many scholars displayed remarkable levels of concentration. They could spend hours, days, or even years pursuing answers to questions that most people never considered. Questions such as, what is the exact relationship between faith and reason? Can divine knowledge coexist with free will? How should ancient texts be interpreted? And, occasionally, questions so obscure that even other scholars wondered whether everyone involved needed a hobby. The point is not that medieval scholars were autistic. Most were not. The point is that medieval society created environments where people with intense intellectual interests could flourish. A person who became fascinated by a narrow subject might find respect rather than ridicule. Their focus became an asset. Their persistence became a strength. Their obsession became expertise. And in many cases, those experts helped preserve and expand human knowledge, leaving behind ideas that still influence the world today. Proof that sometimes the people who seem a little different are the very ones who push society forward. For many medieval people, spending too much time alone was suspicious. For others, it was holy. This strange contradiction created one of the most fascinating spaces in medieval society for people who may have preferred solitude. The world of saints, hermits, and religious recluses. Today, if someone announced they were moving into a tiny hut in the wilderness to avoid most human interaction, their family would probably have questions. Many questions. Medieval people did too. But they also had a category for such individuals. They called them holy. Throughout Europe, thousands of men and women chose lives of extreme solitude. Some lived in forests. Others settled in caves. A few occupied tiny cells attached to churches where they spent years praying, studying, and interacting with only a handful of visitors. These people were known as hermits, anchorites, or recluses, and surprisingly often, society admired them. The most famous examples became local celebrities. Pilgrims travelled long distances to seek their advice. Nobles asked for their prayers. Kings occasionally consulted them on important matters. Imagine becoming so respected that rulers travel for days to hear your opinion. Now imagine achieving that specifically by avoiding people. That is a career path unique to the Middle Ages. Many hermits described finding peace in silence. They preferred predictable routines, long periods of contemplation, and freedom from the social demands of ordinary life. Again, this does not mean they were autistic. Many people simply enjoy solitude. But what matters is that medieval society created an accepted role for individuals who did not fit comfortably into highly social environments. A person who disliked crowds might become a hermit. A person fascinated by scripture could devote years to studying it. A person who found social interaction exhausting might discover that a religious life offered a socially acceptable way to limit it. Not everyone approved, of course. Some critics argued that certain hermits were simply eccentric people hiding from society. Others suspected that a few enjoyed the reputation more than the spiritual discipline. Human nature remains wonderfully consistent. Even in the Middle Ages, people debated whether someone was genuinely holy or merely unusual. Yet many solitary religious figures earned widespread respect because their isolation produced visible results. They became scholars, counselors, writers, and spiritual authorities. In a society that often demanded conformity, these individuals found a surprising degree of freedom, and their stories remind us of something important. Throughout history, some people have always felt most comfortable on the edges of society, not because they hated humanity, but because they simply experienced the world differently from those around them. By now, a pattern is beginning to emerge. Throughout medieval society, certain environments seem to have rewarded traits that modern people often associate with autism: intense focus, attention to detail, comfort with routine, and deep interest in specialized subjects. This does not mean medieval employers were actively searching for neurodivergent workers. The average lord was not conducting personality assessments before hiring a blacksmith. Most were simply hoping the horseshoes stayed attached to the horses. Yet some occupations naturally suited certain kinds of minds. Take the profession of scribe. Before the invention of the printing press, books had to be copied by hand. Every letter mattered. Every page required concentration. One small mistake could ruin hours of work. For many people, this task would have been unbearable. For others, it may have been deeply satisfying. The same was true for weaving. A skilled weaver had to manage intricate patterns, monitor hundreds of threads, and maintain consistency over long periods. Tiny mistakes could disrupt an entire design. Likewise, metalworking demanded precision and patience. A blacksmith learned through endless repetition. Heat the metal, shape it, cool it, repeat, day after day. The work was physically demanding, but it was also highly structured. Many medieval trades operated according to clear systems and predictable procedures. And then there were the accountants. Yes, medieval Europe had accountants. Somebody had to keep track of rents, taxes, harvests, livestock, and payments. Monasteries, noble households, and merchants generated enormous quantities of records. Certain individuals became extraordinarily skilled at organizing information. They tracked inventories, calculated expenses, and maintained documents with a level of dedication that suggests they genuinely enjoyed it. Which is fortunate, because most people would rather wrestle a goose than spend an afternoon counting grain sacks. What makes all of this fascinating is that medieval society often judged people by results rather than personality. A craftsman might be awkward, a scholar might be eccentric, a clerk might dislike social gatherings. But if they performed their duties exceptionally well, many communities overlooked behaviours that seemed unusual. Competence brought tolerance, sometimes quite a lot of tolerance. This was especially true in specialised professions where expertise was rare. A village might have many farmers. It might have only one skilled blacksmith. When someone possesses a valuable skill, society often becomes remarkably flexible about their quirks. And that flexibility allowed many unusual individuals to build successful lives. But not everyone was fortunate enough to have talents that others immediately recognised. For some medieval people, being different could attract something far less pleasant than respect. It could attract suspicion. Unfortunately, not every medieval person who behaved differently found acceptance. Some found suspicion. And in a world with limited scientific understanding, suspicion could spread remarkably fast. The medieval village was a close-knit community. Everyone knew one another's habits, routines, strengths, and weaknesses. This created a sense of belonging, but it also meant unusual behaviour rarely went unnoticed. If someone acted differently, people talked. A lot. In fact, if gossip were a renewable energy source, medieval Europe might have industrialised 5 centuries early. Imagine a villager who rarely attended social gatherings. He avoids festivals. He speaks very little. He spends long periods alone. He becomes intensely interested in unusual subjects that nobody else understands. Some neighbours might simply think he is eccentric. Others might begin asking questions. Why does he keep to himself? Why doesn't he behave like everyone else? What exactly does he do all day? And once a community starts asking those questions, answers often become less important than speculation. Throughout the Middle Ages, people frequently interpreted unfamiliar behaviour through the lens of superstition, religion, or fear. Someone who behaved oddly might be described as strange. Someone who struggled socially could be considered rude. Someone who failed to follow expected customs might be viewed as suspicious. This was especially true during times of crisis. When crops failed, disease spread, or war threatened a region, communities often became less tolerant of differences. Fear has a way of narrowing people's patience. A person who seemed unusual during peaceful times might suddenly become a target of gossip during difficult ones. History repeatedly shows this pattern. When societies feel secure, they often tolerate eccentricity. When societies feel threatened, they often become suspicious of it. The Middle Ages were no exception, yet even here the reality was complicated. Many people who seemed different were still valued by their communities. The quiet blacksmith who made excellent tools might be left alone. The eccentric scholar who provided useful advice could earn respect. The solitary healer who knew valuable remedies might be tolerated despite unusual habits. Medieval people were often more practical than modern stereotypes suggest. If someone contributed something important, neighbours frequently overlooked a great deal. Still, there were limits. The individual who could not conform to basic social expectations, lacked useful status, or attracted the wrong kind of attention sometimes faced exclusion. Not because they were autistic, nobody had that concept, but because humans have always been uneasy around behaviour they do not understand. And that truth may be one of the least medieval things about the Middle Ages. It is, unfortunately, timeless. Modern discussions about autism often focus on challenges, and those challenges are real. Social difficulties, sensory sensitivities, misunderstandings, and communication barriers can all have a significant impact on a person's life. But history suggests there may be another side to the story. A side that medieval people sometimes recognized, even if they lacked the language to describe it. Because many traits associated with autism can also create remarkable strengths. Think about the individuals we've encountered so far. The monk who spent decades preserving manuscripts. The craftsman who noticed tiny flaws invisible to everyone else. The scholar who devoted years to mastering a difficult subject. The accountant who could track enormous amounts of information without losing track of details. These achievements were not possible despite their unusual traits. In many cases, they may have been possible because of them. One of the most common observations throughout history is that certain people possess an extraordinary ability to focus on subjects that genuinely interest them. While others become distracted, they keep going. While others lose patience, they keep learning. While others move on to the next thing, they continue digging deeper and deeper, and somehow even deeper. If you've ever met someone who can happily discuss medieval coin production for 3 hours without noticing that everyone else has quietly left the room, you already understand the phenomenon. The Middle Ages depended heavily on this kind of dedication. Cathedrals were not built by people who became bored after 2 weeks. Libraries were not preserved by individuals who disliked detail. Complex legal systems were not maintained by people who hated organisation. Many of history's greatest accomplishments required persistence that bordered on obsession. The medieval world rewarded mastery, and mastery often required exactly the sort of intense concentration that some people naturally possessed. Of course, these strengths did not erase difficulties. A brilliant scholar could still struggle socially. A talented craftsman could still find social gatherings exhausting. An exceptional scribe could still feel out of place among their peers. Human beings have never been simple collections of strengths and weaknesses. We are mixtures of both. What makes medieval history fascinating is that it reminds us that neurological diversity is not a modern invention. The same range of minds that exists today likely existed centuries ago. Some people thought differently, learned differently, focused differently, experienced the world differently. And despite the challenges they faced, many contributed enormously to the societies around them. Which brings us to perhaps the most important question of all. If these individuals helped build the medieval world, how many other forgotten minds helped shape history without ever knowing there was a name for what made them different? As our journey through the Middle Ages comes to an end, it is worth returning to the question that started it all. Did medieval people have autism? The honest answer is almost certainly yes. But there is an important caveat. We can never know exactly who. No historian can open a manuscript from the year 1200 and discover a chapter titled "Local Carpenter Receives Formal Neurological Assessment." History is rarely that convenient. What we do possess are fragments, descriptions, observations, stories. The quiet child who preferred solitude, the monk who spent 50 years studying a single subject, the craftsman obsessed with perfection, the scholar who understood books better than people, the hermit who felt more comfortable alone than in a crowd. Again and again, medieval records introduce us to individuals whose lives sound surprisingly familiar, not because autism is new, but because it is old, very old, as old as humanity itself. For most of history, people did not have diagnostic labels. They had personalities, reputations, and nicknames. Sometimes flattering nicknames. Sometimes nicknames that would absolutely violate modern workplace policies. A medieval villager might simply be known as the quiet one, the strange one, the clever one, the monk who never stops talking about astronomy, or perhaps the fellow who can identify every bird in the county and somehow remembers all their nesting habits. History rarely tells us how these individuals understood themselves, but it does show us something remarkable. They existed, they worked, they learned, they loved, they struggled, they succeeded, and in many cases, they left lasting marks on the world around them. This is perhaps the greatest lesson hidden within the question of medieval autism. Human diversity is not a modern phenomenon. The modern world did not invent different ways of thinking. It merely developed better language for describing them. The same variety of minds that exist today helped build cathedrals, preserve ancient knowledge, create works of art, manage kingdoms, and pass skills from one generation to the next. Some people fit comfortably into society's expectations, others never quite did. And yet both groups helped shape history. In the end, the story is not really about autism. It is about humanity, about the countless ways human beings experience the world, about how every era contains people who think differently from those around them, and about the possibility that some of the most important contributions in history came from individuals whose minds worked in ways their contemporaries could never fully understand. Which means that somewhere in a medieval village, monastery, workshop, or library, there was probably someone who would feel surprisingly at home in the modern world, though they would almost certainly be horrified by email. Long before Henry VIII settled into his chair, before the first goblet of wine was poured, or the first roast appeared beneath glittering silver platters, Hampton Court Palace was already awake. The royal meal did not begin when the king entered the room. In truth, it had begun hours earlier, while most of England was still rubbing sleep from its eyes. Feeding the most powerful man in the kingdom was less like preparing dinner and more like organising a carefully rehearsed military campaign, except this army fought with ladles instead of swords. Every morning, servants hurried through endless corridors, carrying baskets of vegetables, barrels of ale, sacks of flour, fresh herbs, and entire sides of beef. Deliveries arrived from royal estates across England, bringing the finest ingredients available. Fish came from rivers and the coast, game arrived from royal hunting parks, while gardens supplied fresh greens that had often been picked only moments before. Nothing was left to chance. A disappointing meal reflected poorly on everyone involved, from the lowliest kitchen boy to the Lord Steward himself. The kitchens at Hampton Court were astonishingly large. More than 50 rooms were dedicated solely to preparing food. Massive fireplaces roared continuously, each large enough to roast several animals at once. The air was thick with wood smoke, sizzling fat, and the constant shouting of cooks trying to coordinate dozens of different dishes simultaneously. It was loud, hot, and exhausting. Anyone expecting a peaceful culinary experience would have been deeply disappointed within the first 5 minutes. Hundreds of servants worked together in carefully organised teams. Some butchered meat, while others kneaded bread or stirred enormous cauldrons filled with soup and stew. Young boys spent entire shifts turning heavy roasting spits by hand so the meat cooked evenly. Imagine explaining to your parents that your career ambition was spending 12 hours rotating a pig over a fire. Tudor career counselling was not especially inspiring. Every task followed strict rules. Timing mattered because many dishes had to reach the king while still steaming hot. Unlike today, there were no ovens keeping food warm and certainly no microwave waiting to rescue a forgotten pie. Once a meal left the kitchen, dozens of servants formed an intricate chain, carrying each platter through corridors and courtyards toward the great hall or the king's private apartments. Yet the greatest challenge had nothing to do with cooking itself. Every loaf of bread, every goblet of wine, every slice of meat was destined for a king who trusted very few people. Before Henry ever lifted his knife, another elaborate ritual had to unfold, one designed not to impress his guests, but to ensure the meal would not become his last. If the royal kitchens were the heart of Hampton Court Palace, then the people working inside them were its tireless heartbeat. By the time Henry VIII's dinner approached, hundreds of men and women had already been labouring for hours. Some had started before sunrise, while others had barely slept after preparing the previous evening's feast. Feeding one king and the enormous household that surrounded him required one of the largest domestic workforces in Tudor England. At its peak, Henry's household numbered well over 1,000 people. Not all of them ate alongside the king, of course, but many depended on the palace kitchens for their daily meals. Every day, enormous quantities of food disappeared into hungry mouths. Several oxen, dozens of sheep, countless chickens, mountains of bread, barrels of ale, and rivers of wine seemed to vanish almost as quickly as they arrived. Medieval logistics had evolved into Tudor logistics, and somehow they had become even more complicated. The great kitchens themselves were divided into specialised departments. There was a boiling house for soups and stews, a roasting kitchen with enormous open hearths, pastry kitchens where elaborate pies were assembled, bakehouses producing fresh bread, confectionaries preparing sweet dishes, and separate rooms for sauces, spices, and preserving food. Each area had its own hierarchy, with experienced masters directing apprentices who hoped one day to earn a better position. Perhaps no job was more exhausting than that of the spit boy. His task sounded simple: turn the heavy iron spit so the roasting meat cooked evenly. In reality, it meant standing beside blazing fires for hours, carefully rotating entire pigs, deer, or sides of beef without letting the meat burn. It was hot enough to make anyone reconsider every life choice that had led them to that fireplace. On particularly busy days, they probably smelled more roasted than the dinner itself. Elsewhere, butchers worked with astonishing speed, reducing entire carcasses into usable cuts before passing them to cooks. Bakers carried trays of fresh bread from massive ovens, while brewers ensured ale remained plentiful. Water was not always the safest drink, so even ordinary servants often consumed weak ale throughout the day. Contrary to popular imagination, they were not constantly staggering around drunk. The ale was usually much weaker than modern beer, and often safer than whatever floated in the nearest well. As impressive as this army of workers was, none of their efforts mattered if the meal reached Henry cold, or worse, unsafe. Once every dish had been prepared to perfection, another carefully choreographed ritual began. The food was about to leave the kitchens, and from this point onward, every step was governed by ceremony, security, and absolute precision. Preparing Henry VIII's dinner was only half the battle. Getting it safely from the roaring kitchens to the royal table was an equally delicate operation. The palace was vast, its corridors twisting through courtyards, staircases, galleries, and guarded doorways. A meal might travel several hundred yards before reaching the king. Every step had to be carefully managed because by this point, the food was no longer just dinner. It had become a matter of royal security. The procession began with senior kitchen officials inspecting every dish one final time. Platters were wiped clean around the edges, sauces adjusted, garnishes arranged with surprising care. Presentation mattered almost as much as flavour. Henry enjoyed displays of abundance, and his meals were expected to look as impressive as the wealth of his kingdom. A simple roast chicken might be accompanied by colourful fruits, herbs, elaborate pastries, or decorative sugar sculptures that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Almost. Once approved, servants formed an orderly procession. Each person knew exactly which platter they carried, and precisely where they belonged in the line. This was not a chaotic stampede of hungry cooks escaping a hot kitchen. It was a carefully rehearsed ceremony that reflected the rigid hierarchy of Tudor society. The closer a servant came to handling the king's food, the higher his rank usually was. Carrying Henry's dinner was considered an honour, but also a responsibility. Dropping the king's roast in front of half the court was unlikely to improve one's career prospects. As the procession wound through Hampton Court, guards watched the route carefully. Unauthorised people were kept well away from the dishes. Doors were opened in advance, allowing the line of servants to move without interruption. Every unnecessary delay meant the food cooled slightly, and no one wanted to explain to Henry why his venison had arrived merely warm instead of properly steaming. The greatest concern, however, was not temperature. It was poison. Poison haunted the imagination of Renaissance courts. Political rivals, foreign agents, ambitious nobles, and disgruntled servants all existed in whispered stories of assassination. Whether every rumour was true hardly mattered. Henry believed the danger was real enough to justify extraordinary precautions. His father's dynasty had won the throne only after decades of civil war, and the Tudor crown still felt less than completely secure. A healthy level of paranoia came with wearing it. Before a single bite reached the king's lips, another ceremony now took centre stage. Trusted officers would examine the food, taste the wine, and publicly demonstrate that every course was safe. For Henry, surviving dinner sometimes seemed almost as important as enjoying it. By the time Henry VIII finally approached the dining chamber, his meal had already survived an obstacle course of cooks, servants, guards, and inspections. Yet one final ritual remained before the king could lift his knife. In an age when political alliances shifted as quickly as English weather, poison was considered one of the most terrifying weapons imaginable. A sword could be blocked, an assassin might be spotted, but a poisoned goblet looked exactly like an ordinary one until it was far too late. Whether the danger was as widespread as people believed, is still debated by historians. Actual poisonings were relatively uncommon, but fear itself shaped behaviour. Kings did not need constant assassination attempts to become cautious. They only needed to hear enough stories to wonder whether the next meal might contain something more dangerous than too much pepper. That responsibility fell upon trusted officers known as the gentlemen servers and the royal tasters. Their position demanded absolute loyalty because they stood between the king and anyone who wished him harm. Every dish, every cup of wine, every loaf of bread passed through their hands before it ever reached Henry. One of the most important ceremonies was known as the ceremony of the tasting. It was performed publicly, allowing everyone present to witness that the food had been examined. A servant would taste selected dishes while another sampled the wine. They did not simply nibble politely to avoid offending the chef. They consumed enough to demonstrate genuine confidence that nothing dangerous lurked inside. Of course, modern films often exaggerate this practice, showing a nervous servant collapsing dramatically seconds later while everyone gasps. Real poison rarely behaved with such theatrical timing. If that had been common, court physicians would have become remarkably efficient detectives. Instead, many poisons worked slowly, making certainty difficult. The tasting ceremony was therefore partly practical and partly psychological. It reassured the king while reminding everyone else that protecting him was the household's highest priority. Henry himself remained alert throughout the ritual. Although famous for his enormous appetite, he was no careless eater. Years of political intrigue, rebellions, religious conflict, and shifting loyalties had taught him that a crown attracted enemies as reliably as fresh bread attracted hungry dogs. Trust was a valuable commodity at court, and it was distributed in very small portions. Only after every inspection had been completed, every goblet approved, and every servant had performed his assigned duty, could the king finally sit down. Yet even then, dinner was not merely a meal. The moment Henry entered the room, eating itself became a carefully choreographed performance, where every movement announced exactly who held power in Tudor England. The moment Henry VIII entered the dining chamber, the atmosphere changed completely. Conversations softened, servants straightened their posture, and every pair of eyes discreetly shifted toward the king. This was not simply because everyone respected him. It was because every movement Henry made carried meaning. Even eating his supper became a carefully choreographed ceremony that reinforced his authority over England. Unlike the lively banquets often shown in films, many of Henry's daily meals, particularly later in his reign, were surprisingly formal affairs. If dining in public, he often sat alone beneath an elaborate canopy, known as the cloth of estate. The elevated position physically separated him from everyone else in the room. Even surrounded by dozens of nobles, Henry remained unmistakably the centre of attention. The message required no explanation. There was the king, and then there was everyone else. His place at the table reflected this hierarchy perfectly. Fine linen covered the surface, polished silver gleamed beneath candlelight, and expensive goblets stood beside beautifully crafted plates. Contrary to popular belief, people did not eat from mountains of gold every day. Gold was certainly displayed on important occasions, but silver dominated royal dining because it was valuable, practical, and easier to maintain. Besides, polishing enough gold to satisfy Henry would have given an entire generation of servants permanent arm pain. Before Henry touched a single bite, several rituals unfolded. A senior servant presented water so the king could wash his hands. This was partly about cleanliness, but it was also symbolic. Washing before a meal demonstrated refinement and good breeding. In an age before modern hygiene, it was also one of the smarter habits anyone could develop, especially after spending the morning handling dogs, horses, documents, coins, and countless hands during court business. Only trusted attendants stood close enough to serve the king directly. They carved meat, poured wine, and replaced dishes with practiced precision. Every movement had been rehearsed countless times. There was no reaching awkwardly across the table or asking, "Would your Majesty mind passing the salt?" The servants anticipated Henry's needs before he spoke, and speaking unnecessarily while serving the king was generally discouraged. Around the room, nobles carefully observed proper etiquette. They understood that royal dinners were not simply opportunities to eat well. They were opportunities to be seen. A misplaced gesture, poor manners, or an accidental breach of protocol could damage a reputation that had taken years to build. Tudor politics often unfolded over roasted venison as much as it did inside council chambers. And while everyone admired the magnificent display, the food itself began arriving in waves. Henry's table was about to become a showcase of England's wealth, filled with dishes that ranged from comforting to astonishingly extravagant. Once the ceremony had been completed, and the first dishes appeared before Henry VIII, the sheer quantity of food could leave even the most enthusiastic modern buffet enthusiast feeling slightly intimidated. A royal dinner was never intended to be modest. It was designed to display wealth, stability, and power. Every overflowing platter quietly announced that England's king possessed enough resources to feed an army, even if only one man was doing most of the eating. Meals were served in what the Tudors called courses, but these did not resemble the neat progression of appetizer, main course, and dessert familiar today. Instead, each course consisted of numerous dishes arriving together. The table quickly filled with roasted meats, baked pies, stewed vegetables, fresh bread, fish, pastries, sauces, fruit, and elaborate decorations. Guests helped themselves according to rank and proximity, while Henry enjoyed the finest selections prepared specifically for him. Beef formed the backbone of many royal meals, but it was far from the only option. Venison from the king's hunting parks was especially prized, while swan, peacock, heron, crane, and even porpoise occasionally appeared during grand feasts. Some of these animals were served more for prestige than flavour. Eating roast peacock certainly impressed your guests, although one suspects the peacock remained unconvinced about the whole arrangement. The kitchen also prepared countless pies. Tudor pies were wonderfully practical. Some contained beef, others venison, rabbit, pigeon, eel, or combinations of several meats. Thick pastry cases often acted more like sturdy cooking containers than something meant to be eaten. After baking, the filling remained moist while the crust absorbed grease and protected the contents. Think of it as the 16th century equivalent of disposable cookware, except considerably heavier and far less likely to fit inside a modern dishwasher. Fish remained essential, particularly on religious fasting days when meat was forbidden by church rules. Salmon, trout, cod, herring, pike, oysters, mussels, and eels frequently appeared on royal tables. Clever cooks found endless ways to prepare them using herbs, wine, butter, vinegar, and imported spices. Tudor chefs understood that variety kept both diners and kings interested. Those imported spices represented astonishing wealth. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, mace, saffron, and pepper travelled thousands of miles before reaching England. They cost fortunes and were used generously in royal kitchens. Modern diners often expect medieval food to be bland, but Henry's cooks had quite the opposite philosophy. If a dish could hold another pinch of expensive spice, they usually added it. Yet despite this remarkable abundance, eating remained governed by strict etiquette. Knowing how to behave at the royal table mattered almost as much as knowing what was being served, because one careless mistake could attract exactly the kind of attention no courtier wanted. A royal meal under Henry VIII was not simply about satisfying hunger. It was also an examination that everyone present took, whether they realised it or not. Every movement, every gesture, and every word could reveal breeding, education, loyalty, and social rank. The food might have been magnificent, but the real performance was taking place around the table. One of the first rules concerned where you sat. Seating was never random. The closer someone sat to the king, the greater their importance. Powerful nobles occupied the most prestigious places, while lesser courtiers found themselves farther away. Some important guests were fortunate enough to dine in Henry's presence. Others, despite holding respectable positions, ate elsewhere in the palace. Being invited to the king's table was a privilege that could raise a person's reputation almost overnight. Conversation itself followed invisible rules. People did not interrupt the king or loudly dominate discussions. When Henry spoke, others listened carefully. If he asked a question, the answer needed to be thoughtful without sounding overly rehearsed. Speak too little, and you appeared dull. Speak too much, and you risked appearing arrogant. Navigating Tudor conversation required the balance of a tightrope walker carrying a tray of expensive wine. Table manners were equally important. Diners washed their hands before eating, partly for cleanliness, and partly because many foods were handled directly with the fingers. Forks, although beginning to appear elsewhere in Europe, had not yet become common in England. Most people relied on knives, spoons, and their hands. This sounds messy by modern standards, but there were strict expectations about how those hands should be used. Guests were expected to eat neatly and with restraint. Grabbing the largest portion, stuffing one's mouth, or reaching awkwardly across the table reflected badly on a person's character. Bread often served as both food and utensil, helping to scoop sauces or accompany meat. Bones and scraps were placed carefully aside rather than tossed carelessly onto the floor, despite what many modern films suggest. Tudor nobles appreciated elegance, even if their dinners involved considerably more gravy than today's formal banquets. Napkins, usually made of linen, rested across the lap or over one shoulder. Wiping greasy fingers on expensive clothing was strongly discouraged, a rule that has somehow survived remarkably well into the present day. Human civilization has achieved many things, but agreeing not to clean butter off your sleeves remains one of its quieter successes. Perhaps most importantly, everyone watched everyone else. Courtiers observed rivals, ambassadors studied English customs, servants noticed shifting alliances, and Henry himself paid close attention to the behaviour of those around him. A royal dinner was one of the few places where politics, ambition, and etiquette occupied exactly the same table. By the time the final dishes began to disappear, the meal had accomplished far more than filling empty stomachs. It had reinforced the entire social order of Tudor England, one carefully choreographed dinner at a time. No matter how grand the meal had been, eventually the final platter was cleared away, the last goblet emptied, and the enormous performance surrounding Henry VIII's dinner began to wind down. Yet, even the ending followed traditions that had been refined over generations. A royal feast did not simply stop because everyone had eaten enough. Like every other part of Tudor court life, it concluded with ceremony, hierarchy, and one final reminder of who ruled England. As servants removed the dishes, they worked with the same quiet precision they had shown throughout the meal. Empty platters disappeared almost as quickly as they had arrived. Linen cloths were straightened, goblets collected, and crumbs brushed from the table. Nothing was left untidy for long. An orderly dining chamber reflected an orderly kingdom, at least in theory. In reality, keeping several hundred well-fed nobles perfectly organised was probably rather like attempting to herd geese that happened to own castles. Henry rarely lingered over dinner. Despite his love of food, ambassadors and visitors often remarked that he ate surprisingly quickly. He had matters of state waiting for him, petitions to review, council meetings to attend, ambassadors to receive, and disputes that required his attention. Running a kingdom left remarkably little time for leisurely conversation over dessert. That did not mean the evening immediately became quiet. Music frequently followed important meals. Skilled musicians played lutes, viols, flutes, and harps, while singers entertained the court. On especially festive occasions, jesters, acrobats, and actors performed before the king. Henry himself genuinely enjoyed music and was an accomplished musician in his younger years, composing songs and playing several instruments. Before age, injuries, and politics hardened his temperament, he had been considered one of the most athletic and cultured princes in Europe. Meanwhile, far from the royal apartments, another feast quietly unfolded. Once the king and his highest-ranking guests had finished, food that remained was distributed throughout the enormous household according to rank. Senior officers received generous portions, while ordinary servants also benefited from the palace kitchens. Very little edible food was deliberately wasted. Leftovers fed hundreds of mouths, and sometimes even found their way to charitable distribution outside the palace gates. In an age when famine could still threaten entire communities, wasting perfectly good food would have seemed astonishingly irresponsible. As evening settled over Hampton Court, fires in the kitchens gradually burned lower, exhausted cooks scrubbed enormous pots, and servants prepared for another day that would begin before dawn. Tomorrow's meal was already occupying someone's thoughts. The king's appetite never took holidays. For Henry VIII, dinner had been far more than a chance to satisfy his hunger. It was a daily display of wealth, authority, loyalty, and tradition. Every roast, every servant, every ceremony, and every carefully observed rule reminded everyone present that the Tudor monarchy was not merely governing England, it was performing its power, one magnificent meal at a time. When Henry VIII finally rose from the table, dinner itself might have been over, but the work surrounding it was far from finished. While the king returned to matters of government, private conversation, or evening entertainment, hundreds of servants remained hard at work. A royal meal left behind mountains of dishes, exhausted cooks, smouldering fires, and enough leftover bread, bones, and empty barrels to keep an entire workforce occupied well into the night. If you had asked a samurai what his greatest possession was, he probably would not have pointed to his sword, his armour, his horse, or even his land. Instead, he would have given an answer that sounds almost unbelievable today. His greatest possession was his honour. Lose your house, and perhaps you could rebuild it. Lose your fortune, and another opportunity might eventually appear. But lose your honour, and in the eyes of feudal Japan, you had lost the very thing that made your life worth living. To understand the crimes that could destroy a samurai, you first have to understand the world he lived in. This was a society built on hierarchy. At the very top stood the shogun. Beneath him, powerful daimyo ruled their own territories, and below them served thousands of samurai whose entire identity revolved around duty, loyalty, and reputation. Every person knew exactly where they stood, and stepping outside that place often carried serious consequences. From an early age, boys born into samurai families were taught that courage, discipline, and self-control were not optional virtues. They were expectations. A future warrior learned to ride horses, master the bow, wield the spear, and eventually become skilled with the sword. Yet physical training was only part of the education. just as important was learning how to behave. Respect toward superiors, kindness toward loyal servants, restraint during conflict, and absolute control over one's emotions were considered marks of true refinement. Losing your temper too easily suggested that you had not yet mastered yourself. This way of thinking became closely associated with what we now call Bushido, often translated as the way of the warrior. While the code evolved over centuries and was never written as one universal rulebook, its ideals shaped samurai culture. Loyalty, honesty, courage, justice, and honor formed the foundation of a warrior's life. Living by these principles brought respect. Failing them invited disgrace. That disgrace reached far beyond the individual. A samurai's actions reflected upon his parents, his children, his ancestors, and the lord he served. One shameful act could stain an entire family for generations. Reputation travelled quickly through castle towns, and stories of cowardice or betrayal spread faster than official announcements. Long before newspapers or social media existed, people had perfected the ancient art of talking about other people's mistakes. Because of this, every decision carried enormous weight. A careless word, an act of dishonesty, or a moment of weakness could begin a chain of events that ended in exile, poverty, or even death. For a samurai, the greatest fear was not always dying in battle. It was living long enough to watch his honor disappear, piece by piece. That fear shaped every aspect of his life and made the crimes we are about to explore far more terrifying than they might first appear. If honor formed the soul of a samurai, then loyalty was the chain that held everything together. A samurai did not simply work for his lord in the modern sense of the word. His entire identity was tied to the daimyo he served. His income, his social standing, his family's future, and often his very reason for existing depended upon that relationship. To betray one's lord was not viewed as a simple crime. It was seen as an attack on the very order that held feudal Japan together. Every samurai swore allegiance to a daimyo, one of the great regional lords who governed lands on behalf of the shogun. In exchange for military service and unwavering obedience, the daimyo granted land, rice stipends, protection, and status. It was a relationship built upon mutual obligation, but the balance of power was hardly equal. A lord could reward faithful service with wealth and promotion. He could also strip everything away with a single command. Obedience extended far beyond the battlefield. A samurai might be ordered to collect taxes, oversee a castle gate, escort an important official, investigate a dispute between villages, or travel across dangerous provinces carrying confidential messages. Whatever the assignment, it was expected to be carried out faithfully and without unnecessary complaint. Refusing an order simply because it was unpleasant was almost unthinkable. Of course, reality was rarely so straightforward. Not every daimyo was wise, honourable, or even competent. Some were brilliant leaders who inspired fierce devotion. Others were arrogant, reckless, or consumed by personal ambition. This created a painful dilemma. What happened if a lord gave an order that seemed dishonourable? Should a samurai obey without question, or refuse in order to preserve his own sense of justice? Different warriors answered that question differently, and history remembers examples of both choices. Some believed loyalty demanded absolute obedience regardless of personal opinion. Others argued that true loyalty sometimes meant preventing a foolish lord from destroying himself. Neither path was without danger. Advising a powerful daimyo that he was making a terrible decision required extraordinary courage and perhaps an appreciation for very short careers. The greatest betrayal, however, was openly turning against one's lord. Joining a rival clan, revealing military secrets, abandoning the battlefield without permission, or plotting assassination ranked among the gravest crimes imaginable. Such acts threatened not only one man, but the security of entire provinces. Punishments were severe. Property could be confiscated, families disgraced, and the offender sentenced to execution or ordered to take his own life through ritual suicide. Yet even a samurai who remained loyal could lose everything through another failing that every warrior dreaded. In battle, courage was expected. Showing fear at the wrong moment could destroy a reputation just as completely as betrayal ever could. For a samurai, few accusations carried more shame than being called a coward. Losing a battle was unfortunate. Being overwhelmed by impossible odds could even earn respect. But abandoning one's duty through fear was something entirely different. It was a stain that could follow a warrior for the rest of his life, long after the wounds of battle had healed and the banners had been folded away. From childhood, samurai were taught that death was always a possibility. Every lesson with the sword, every hour spent practicing archery from horseback, and every lecture on discipline prepared them for a simple reality. One day they might be asked to risk everything for their lord. The expectation was not that they would survive. The expectation was that they would stand their ground. This did not mean samurai were fearless. They were human beings after all. An arrow flying toward your face tends to inspire the same universal reaction regardless of culture or century. Horses panicked, drums thundered across the valley, smoke filled the air, and soldiers watched friends fall around them. Fear was unavoidable. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to continue despite it. Battle itself was often far more chaotic than popular stories suggest. Films frequently portray elegant duels between famous warriors, while everyone else politely waits for the outcome. Reality was considerably messier. Arrows darkened the sky, spear formations collided, cavalry charged through muddy fields, and commands were sometimes impossible to hear over the noise. A samurai had to make life or death decisions within seconds, often with very little information. Running away without orders, abandoning one's post, or leaving fellow warriors exposed could have disastrous consequences. A single retreat at the wrong moment might open a gap in the battle line, allowing enemy troops to break through and turn an orderly defense into complete disaster. One frightened warrior could unintentionally condemn hundreds of others. Because of this, commanders punished cowardice harshly. A samurai who fled the battlefield without permission risked losing his lands, his position, and his family's reputation. In particularly serious cases, he could be ordered to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, as a final opportunity to reclaim a measure of honor through death. It was a grim reminder that in feudal Japan, surviving dishonor was sometimes considered worse than dying with dignity. Yet the judgment of cowardice was not always simple. Experienced commanders occasionally ordered strategic withdrawals to preserve their forces. Retreating under orders required discipline and courage of its own. The disgrace came not from falling back, but from placing personal survival above duty. Ironically, some of the greatest threats to a samurai's honor did not occur on the battlefield at all. They happened during times of peace, when no swords were drawn, and temptation quietly whispered from within, rather than charging from across the field. Not every crime that ruined a samurai involved swords, battlefields, or dramatic betrayals. Some began much more quietly, with a purse of silver slipped beneath a table, a missing sack of rice, or a tax record that somehow failed to match reality. While courage often defined a samurai's public reputation, honesty determined whether he deserved the trust that came with his position. A warrior who could not be trusted with responsibility soon discovered that honor disappeared just as quickly in an office as it did on a battlefield. Contrary to popular imagination, many samurai spent far more time managing paperwork than fighting enemies. During the long peace of the Tokugawa period, which lasted for more than 2 centuries, relatively few warriors ever experienced major battles. Instead, they became administrators, magistrates, castle officials, tax collectors, police officers, and judges. Their swords still hung proudly at their sides, but many of their daily battles involved documents rather than duels. These positions gave them considerable authority. A magistrate settled disputes between merchants. A tax official calculated how much rice villages owed their daimyo. Castle administrators supervised warehouses filled with valuable supplies, while other officials distributed stipends to fellow samurai. With so much wealth passing through their hands, opportunities for corruption were never far away. Accepting bribes ranked among the most serious offences. Imagine 2 merchants arguing over ownership of valuable land. If one secretly paid the judge to rule in his favour, justice disappeared before the hearing had even begun. Such behaviour damaged more than the individuals involved. It weakened confidence in the entire government. A lord who could not trust his own officials soon found it difficult to trust anyone at all. Stealing from one's lord was even worse. Rice was the foundation of Japan's economy, functioning almost like currency. Samurai were often paid in rice stipends, taxes were collected in rice, and entire domains measured wealth by how much rice they produced. Skimming a few sacks from government warehouses might seem insignificant at first glance, but repeated often enough, it became theft on a remarkable scale. It was rather like quietly helping yourself to a small piece of the kingdom every week and hoping nobody noticed. Eventually, somebody always did. Punishments varied according to the crime and the status of the offender. Lesser officials could lose their position, property, or family privileges. More serious offenders faced imprisonment, execution, or orders to commit seppuku. A lifetime spent building a respectable name could vanish because of one dishonest decision made in a moment of greed. For a samurai, the greatest irony was that many of these crimes happened during peaceful times. When there were no wars to fight, the real test of character often came from resisting temptation, and among all temptations, few proved more dangerous than allowing personal ambition to outweigh loyalty itself. For a samurai, honour was never something he carried alone. Every decision he made reflected not only upon himself, but upon his parents, his ancestors, his children, and even generations yet to be born. His family name was a living inheritance, carefully built over decades or even centuries through loyal service, military courage, and faithful conduct. To disgrace that name was considered one of the cruelest things a samurai could do, not because it wounded his pride, but because it punished people who had committed no crime at all. Family reputation was everything in feudal Japan. Noble households carefully preserved records of their ancestors, celebrating victories, loyal service, and important appointments. A respected family gained opportunities. Their sons found better positions, advantageous marriages became possible, and powerful lords viewed them as trustworthy retainers. Reputation functioned almost like invisible wealth, passed down from one generation to the next. The opposite was equally true. If a samurai became known for dishonesty, cowardice, drunken violence, or betrayal, that stain did not disappear with his death. His descendants often carried the burden long afterward. Other clans hesitated to marry into the family. Lords questioned whether loyalty truly ran in their blood. Even innocent children could spend years trying to repair damage caused by one reckless ancestor. Because of this, samurai were expected to conduct themselves properly, not only in public but also in private. Excessive gambling, constant drunkenness, uncontrolled anger, or abusing those beneath them reflected poorly on the entire household. A warrior was expected to demonstrate discipline at all times. Losing control of one's behaviour suggested that the discipline learned through years of training had accomplished very little. Marriage carried similar expectations. Families often arranged marriages to strengthen alliances between important households. A scandal involving adultery or public misconduct threatened far more than one unhappy relationship. It could damage political alliances, create feuds between powerful clans, and embarrass everyone connected to both families. Personal choices rarely remained personal for very long. Financial irresponsibility could also bring disgrace. Some samurai, particularly during the peaceful Tokugawa era, struggled with debt. Their incomes remained fixed while expenses continued to rise. Maintaining fine clothing, respectable residences, servants, weapons, and proper appearances became increasingly expensive. A few borrowed far beyond their means, hoping better fortunes would eventually arrive. Unfortunately, creditors possessed an irritating habit of expecting repayment regardless of a warrior's noble ancestry. Even something as simple as failing to educate one's children properly reflected badly upon the head of the household. Sons were expected to inherit not only swords, but values. If they grew into dishonest or undisciplined adults, many believed the father had failed long before the son ever made his first mistake. In the samurai world, honor resembled a carefully polished mirror. It took years of patience to keep it shining, yet only one careless crack could leave damage that echoed through an entire family for generations. And for some warriors, the greatest disgrace came not from their own failures, but from turning their swords against those they had once sworn to protect. A samurai carried two swords almost everywhere he went. Together they symbolized his rank, his authority, and his duty. But those swords came with an expectation that was just as important as knowing how to use them, knowing when not to. Contrary to popular legends, a samurai could not simply cut down anyone who irritated him. Doing so without proper justification could cost him everything he had spent a lifetime earning. In feudal Japan, violence was governed by surprisingly strict rules. Samurai occupied the warrior class, but they were also expected to serve as examples of discipline. Drawing a blade in anger was not considered proof of strength. More often, it suggested a dangerous lack of self-control. A warrior who reached for his sword every time he was insulted would soon find himself without many neighbours and, quite possibly, without his position. This became especially important during the long peace established by the Tokugawa shogunate. For more than 2 centuries, large-scale warfare became relatively rare. Castle towns flourished, merchants grew wealthy, and daily life became far more orderly than during the centuries of civil war. Samurai now walked crowded streets alongside craftsmen, farmers, monks, and traders. A careless sword swing in a busy marketplace could create chaos far beyond a personal dispute. One famous privilege often misunderstood today was kirisute gomen, sometimes translated as the right to cut down. Under very specific circumstances, a samurai could strike someone who had seriously insulted or attacked him. However, this was not a license to kill over minor disagreements. The samurai was expected to prove that the offence had been severe enough to justify deadly force. Witnesses might be questioned, officials investigated the incident, and an unjustified killing could bring harsh punishment instead of praise. Imagine explaining that you ended a man's life because he bumped into your shoulder while carrying vegetables through a crowded street. Even many officials of the time would have found that explanation rather unconvincing. Killing another samurai without lawful cause carried even greater consequences. Such an act threatened the fragile balance between powerful families and could ignite feuds lasting generations. Depending on the circumstances, the offender might lose his lands, be imprisoned, executed, or ordered to commit seppuku to preserve what little honor remained. Even if he believed himself justified, convincing the authorities was another matter entirely. A samurai was expected to master his emotions before mastering his sword. Patience, restraint, and careful judgment separated a respected warrior from a reckless thug carrying expensive weapons. Anyone could lose their temper. A true samurai was expected to control it. Ironically, however, even perfect self-control could not protect a warrior from the greatest danger of all. Sometimes the crime that destroyed a samurai was not committed with anger or greed, but with a single decision to place his own life above the honor he had sworn to defend. For all the crimes a samurai feared, there was one punishment that haunted nearly every warrior more than imprisonment or even death. It was the loss of status. To be stripped of the right to call yourself a samurai was to lose your identity, your livelihood, your family honor, and your place in society all at once. In feudal Japan, this was not simply a professional setback. It was the complete destruction of the life you had been born to live. Being a samurai was not merely an occupation, it was a legal class. Samurai alone enjoyed privileges that separated them from the rest of society. They had the right to carry the daisho, the paired long and short swords that symbolized their rank. They received stipends from their lord, wore distinctive clothing, and occupied positions of authority as military officers, administrators, and government officials. These privileges came with heavy responsibilities, but they also defined who a samurai was. When a warrior committed a serious offense, his lord could remove those privileges entirely. The confiscation of land was often the first blow. Many samurai relied on rice stipends or estates granted by their daimyo. Without them, supporting a household became almost impossible. Servants had to be dismissed, horses sold, armor pawned, and family possessions gradually disappeared. A house that had stood proudly for generations could fall into poverty within a few years. Then came the loss of rank. A disgraced samurai might be dismissed from his lord's service, becoming what the Japanese called a ronin, a masterless samurai. Not every ronin had committed a crime. Some lost their lords through war, political upheaval, or natural death. But for those expelled because of disgrace, life became especially difficult. Other daimyo hesitated to employ someone whose previous master had judged unworthy. Reputation travelled quickly across Japan's castle towns, and few employers wanted to gamble on a man already marked by scandal. Without steady income, many ronin struggled to survive. Some became teachers of swordsmanship or military strategy. Others worked as bodyguards, scribes, or instructors. A few drifted into gambling, crime, or mercenary work simply to put food on the table. The fall could be astonishingly swift. A man who once advised governors might soon find himself selling family heirlooms just to afford his next meal. The psychological burden was often even greater than the financial one. Imagine spending your entire childhood being told that your purpose was to serve your lord with honor, only to wake one morning and discover that title had been taken away forever. The swords at your waist remained the same pieces of steel, but they no longer carried the same meaning. For many samurai, that unbearable loss of identity explains why some chose another path entirely. Rather than live with permanent disgrace, they accepted one final duty, one that they believed could restore the honor that everything else had stripped away. The next chapter explores that solemn and deeply misunderstood ritual. For many people today, the idea seems almost impossible to understand. Why would someone willingly choose death instead of continuing to live? Yet for countless samurai, the answer was rooted in a lifetime of values that placed honor above everything else. When disgrace became unavoidable, seppuku, ritual suicide, was often viewed not as surrender, but as the final opportunity to preserve dignity. Contrary to popular imagination, seppuku was not performed casually or for every mistake. It was reserved for serious situations. A samurai who had betrayed his lord, failed catastrophically in battle, committed a grave offence, or faced unavoidable disgrace might be ordered to perform it by his daimyo. In other cases, a warrior chose it voluntarily, believing death preferable to living in permanent shame. The ritual itself followed strict traditions that had developed over centuries. It was not a spontaneous act carried out in anger or despair. It was a formal ceremony that reflected discipline even in one's final moments. The samurai first bathed and dressed in clean white robes, the colour associated with purity. He often composed a final death poem, expressing his thoughts in calm, elegant language. These poems rarely spoke of fear. Instead, they reflected on nature, the passing seasons, or the fleeting nature of life itself. Even at the edge of death, a warrior was expected to demonstrate composure and refinement. Witnesses gathered quietly as the ceremony began. A trusted companion, known as the kaishakunin, stood nearby with a drawn sword. His role was both difficult and deeply honourable. After the samurai made the initial wound to his abdomen, the companion delivered a swift strike to end his suffering as quickly as possible. This required extraordinary skill. Too soon, and the ritual lost its meaning. Too late, and unnecessary agony followed. It was one of the heaviest responsibilities another samurai could accept. Modern stories often present seppuku as something every samurai eagerly embraced. Reality was far more complicated. No amount of training completely erased the natural fear of death. These were human beings with families, ambitions, friendships, and dreams. Many undoubtedly dreaded the moment. What distinguished them was not the absence of fear, but the belief that fulfilling one's duty outweighed personal survival. Not every disgraced samurai was granted the privilege of seppuku. That is an important detail often overlooked. Common criminals were usually executed in far less honourable ways. Being ordered to commit seppuku was, paradoxically, considered a sign that the authorities still recognised the samurai's status and believed he deserved an opportunity to reclaim his honour through a dignified death. Ancient Greece was not one united country. It was a patchwork of independent city-states, each proud of its own traditions, laws, and ambitions. Athens competed with Sparta. Corinth sought influence through trade. Thebes guarded its own interests. Smaller cities constantly shifted between alliances and rivalries, while wars erupted often enough that many Greeks grew up expecting conflict as a normal part of life. Yet several times each year, something extraordinary happened. The fighting stopped. Not forever, of course. Ancient politicians were no more capable of resisting arguments than modern ones. But during the greatest religious festivals, a sacred truce known as the Ekecheiria was declared. This agreement allowed travellers to cross the Greek world safely on their way to the sanctuaries of the gods. Even bitter enemies understood that interfering with pilgrims was not merely an insult to another city. It was considered an offence against the gods themselves. As news of the truce spread, roads that had recently carried marching soldiers began filling with very different travellers. Athletes walked beside philosophers. Farmers travelled alongside wealthy merchants. Priests, musicians, poets, craftsmen, and entire families packed their belongings and set out on journeys that sometimes lasted several days, or even weeks. Donkeys carried supplies, wagons rattled along dusty tracks, and ships crossed the Aegean Sea packed with passengers eager to reach the celebrations. The closer they came to the great sanctuaries, the busier the roads became. Travellers exchanged stories around evening campfires, debated politics, argued over whose city produced the finest athletes, and shared food beneath the stars. It was one of the few occasions when people from every corner of the Greek world gathered peacefully in the same place. If someone claimed Sparta had the best warriors while an Athenian insisted intelligence mattered more than muscles, the discussion probably lasted well into the night. Some debates, it seems, never truly disappear. Upon arriving, visitors encountered scenes unlike anything they experienced back home. Temporary markets stretched along the roads leading to the sanctuaries. Merchants sold pottery, jewellery, olive oil, wine, perfumes, and beautifully crafted bronze objects. Musicians entertained passing crowds while storytellers recited famous myths. Inns overflowed with guests, tents covered nearby fields, and the sound of countless conversations filled the air from sunrise until long after sunset. These festivals were far more than holidays. They united a civilization that otherwise spent much of its time divided. For a few precious days, people stopped thinking of themselves primarily as Athenians, Spartans, Corinthians, or Argives. Instead, they remembered that despite their rivalries, they shared the same language, worshipped many of the same gods, and belonged to the wider Greek world. And before the games could begin, before actors stepped onto the stage or musicians lifted their instruments, every celebration started with the most important purpose of all: honouring the gods who had made this remarkable gathering possible. Long before the first wrestler entered the arena, before the opening notes of a musician echoed across the hills, and before actors stepped onto the stage wearing towering masks, the ancient Greeks gathered for a far more important reason. Every great festival began as an act of worship. The competitions, feasts and celebrations were magnificent, but they all existed to honour the gods. Without the religious ceremonies, there would have been no festival at all. As dawn broke over the sacred sanctuaries, priests prepared the temples for the day's rituals. Fresh flowers decorated altars, incense drifted into the cool morning air, and attendants swept the stone courtyards where thousands of visitors would soon gather. The towering temples themselves seemed to glow beneath the rising sun, their marble columns catching the first light while pilgrims quietly assembled outside. People arrived carrying offerings from every corner of Greece. Some brought baskets filled with fruit, fresh bread, jars of honey, olive oil, or fine wine. Wealthier visitors sometimes donated beautifully crafted bronze tripods, silver bowls, or elaborately painted pottery. Even those with very little tried to bring something. The value of an offering was measured not only by its cost, but by the respect it demonstrated toward the gods. Soon the religious procession began. Priests led the way wearing ceremonial robes, followed by magistrates, musicians playing the haunting melodies of the aulos, young women carrying sacred baskets, and citizens holding branches of olive or laurel. Behind them came hundreds, sometimes thousands, of ordinary pilgrims. The entire procession moved slowly toward the temple while hymns filled the air. Imagine an entire city walking together in complete purpose, except with considerably fewer mobile phones interrupting the atmosphere. At the centre of many ceremonies stood the animal sacrifice, a practice that may seem unfamiliar or uncomfortable to modern audiences, but was one of the most sacred acts in Greek religion. Carefully selected cattle, sheep, goats, or pigs were washed, decorated with ribbons, and led to the altar. Before the sacrifice, prayers were offered, asking the gods for protection, prosperity, victory, or good harvests. Afterward, the animal was prepared according to strict religious customs. Certain portions, particularly the thigh bones wrapped in fat, were burned as offerings to the gods. The remaining meat was cooked and shared among the participants. This transformed the ceremony into a communal feast, where worshippers believed they were symbolically dining in the presence of the deity they honoured. For many ordinary Greeks, these festivals also provided one of the few opportunities to enjoy generous portions of meat. The sanctuaries themselves became living museums of gratitude. Victorious generals dedicated captured weapons. Successful athletes left statues of themselves. Cities donated magnificent treasuries filled with gifts honouring Zeus, Apollo, Athena, or Dionysus. Every offering told a story of thanksgiving, hope, or ambition. Only after the sacrifices were complete, the prayers spoken, and the gods properly honoured, could the celebrations truly begin. Now, with divine favour hopefully secured, the crowds turned toward the contests that would make these festivals legendary throughout the Greek world. With the sacrifices complete and the blessings of Zeus respectfully requested, attention shifted toward the event that would become the most famous athletic festival in human history. Every 4 years, thousands of Greeks made the journey to Olympia, a peaceful sanctuary in the western Peloponnese. For a few remarkable days, the greatest athletes from across the Greek world gathered to compete, not for riches, but for something they often valued even more: everlasting glory. The sanctuary itself buzzed with excitement long before the competitions began. Tents covered the surrounding fields, merchants opened busy stalls, philosophers debated beneath the shade of olive trees, and spectators searched for the best places to watch the events. Visitors from Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and dozens of smaller cities stood shoulder to shoulder. Many of these people might normally have viewed one another with suspicion. Here, however, they shared the same anticipation as they waited to witness extraordinary displays of human strength and skill. Not just anyone could compete. Athletes trained for years before earning the chance to appear at Olympia. They also had to prove they were free Greek men and swear an oath before the statue of Zeus that they would compete honestly. Cheating was considered both disgraceful and sacrilegious. Anyone caught bribing opponents or breaking the rules faced heavy fines and lasting embarrassment. Ancient Greece may not have had instant replay, but it certainly had strong opinions about fair play. The games began with foot races, the oldest Olympic event. Runners exploded down the stadium track barefoot, sprinting over packed earth while thousands of spectators shouted encouragement. Victory often came down to the smallest margin imaginable. There were no electronic timers or photo finishes. The judges simply watched with experienced eyes, hoping no one crossed the line while simultaneously arguing about it. Combat sports followed. Wrestling demanded strength, balance, and technique. Boxing was considerably more brutal than its modern counterpart. Fighters wrapped hardened leather straps around their hands, but wore no protective gloves or headgear. Broken noses, swollen eyes, and missing teeth were accepted as unfortunate but perfectly ordinary souvenirs. Then came the pancration, perhaps the most feared event of all. It combined wrestling and boxing into a contest where almost anything was permitted except biting and gouging the eyes. Competitors threw, struck, locked joints, and fought until one man admitted defeat or became unable to continue. It was an astonishing display of endurance that made even experienced spectators wince. The phrase "friendly sporting event" had clearly not yet been invented. Elsewhere, horses thundered around the hippodrome, pulling chariots at breathtaking speed. Wealthy aristocrats often sponsored these teams, since maintaining racing horses required enormous expense. Chariot races thrilled the crowds, but were also incredibly dangerous. Crashes sent splintered wood, frightened horses, and drivers tumbling across the track. Winning brought immense prestige. Simply finishing sometimes felt like an impressive achievement. And after days of competition, only one prize awaited each champion, a simple wreath woven from wild olive branches. No gold, no silver, no treasure chest overflowing with coins. Yet when those victorious athletes returned home, entire cities welcomed them as heroes. Some received free meals for life, generous rewards, statues, and songs celebrating their names. The olive wreath itself cost almost nothing, but the honour it represented was priceless. When the cheers of the Olympic crowds faded into memory, another great festival revealed a very different side of ancient Greece. At Delphi, nestled high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, victory was not measured only by speed, strength, or endurance. Here, during the Pythian Games, beauty itself became a competition. Music echoed through the sacred valley, poets recited verses, singers performed before enormous audiences, and artists competed for glory beneath the watchful gaze of Apollo, the god of music, poetry, and prophecy. Delphi already held a special place in the Greek imagination. Pilgrims travelled from every corner of the Mediterranean to consult the famous oracle of Apollo, seeking advice before wars, colonization, marriages, and political decisions. Kings, generals, merchants, and ordinary farmers all climbed the winding mountain roads, hoping the god might offer guidance. During the Pythian festival, however, the sanctuary transformed into something even more remarkable. Alongside priests and pilgrims came musicians carrying delicate instruments, choruses rehearsing harmonies, and poets quietly repeating their lines before stepping into the spotlight. The festival's musical competitions were among the most prestigious in Greece. Contestants performed on the kithara, a large professional lyre associated with Apollo himself. Unlike the smaller lyre commonly played at home, the kithara demanded years of practice to master. Its rich sound filled open courtyards, carrying across the sanctuary as audiences listened in respectful silence. Every note mattered. One poorly played passage could separate a forgotten performer from a future champion. The haunting sound of the aulos also filled the air. This double reed instrument, often played with two pipes at once, produced a powerful, emotional tone, unlike anything heard in modern orchestras. Skilled musicians could make it sound joyful, mournful, or even unsettling depending on the occasion. If someone unfamiliar with ancient Greek music suddenly heard an aulos, they might wonder whether a snake was singing opera. The Greeks, however, considered it one of their finest instruments. Singers competed both as solo performers and in carefully rehearsed choirs. Their voices honoured Apollo through hymns that celebrated his victories, his wisdom, and his protection over Delphi. Judges listened closely, evaluating not only technical skill, but also emotion, pronunciation, rhythm, and devotion. Music was not merely entertainment. It was an offering to the gods, and excellence reflected respect as much as talent. Poets stood before the crowds to recite newly composed works, while storytellers brought familiar myths to life through dramatic performances. Many Greeks learned the legends of Heracles, Perseus, Jason, and the Trojan War, not by reading books, but by hearing gifted performers recite them aloud. In a world where literacy was far from universal, memory became an extraordinary art form. A talented poet could hold thousands of listeners completely silent using nothing more than his voice. The Pythian Games reminded every visitor that greatness came in many forms. Some heroes earned glory with powerful arms and swift feet. Others achieved immortality through melodies, poetry, and stories that continued echoing long after the final note had faded into the mountain air. And nowhere would storytelling become more powerful than in the grand theatres of Athens, where entire cities gathered to laugh, weep, and watch the greatest dramas ever written, If the Pythian Games celebrated the beauty of music, then Athens transformed storytelling into one of the greatest public spectacles of the ancient world. Every spring, during the city Dionysia, thousands of people climbed the southern slope of the Acropolis and took their seats in one of history's most remarkable theatres. They had not gathered simply to be entertained. They had come to witness performances that explored war, justice, family, love, revenge, politics, and the complicated nature of being human. For several unforgettable days, the entire city became an audience. The festival honoured Dionysus, the god of wine, celebration, fertility, and theatre itself. Like every major Greek festival, it began with religious ceremonies. Priests led processions through Athens, carrying sacred statues and offering sacrifices before the dramatic competitions officially opened. Only after the gods had received proper respect did the actors take the stage. The theatre of Dionysus was unlike any building most people had ever seen. Carved into the hillside beneath the Acropolis, it could accommodate thousands of spectators. Citizens, visiting foreigners, ambassadors, and honoured guests filled the stone seats from sunrise until evening. Looking across the audience, you could see nearly every layer of Athenian society gathered in one place. It was one of the few occasions when politics, religion, art, and public life blended into a single extraordinary event. The plays themselves were competitions. Several playwrights presented groups of tragedies, hoping judges would declare their work the finest of the festival. Winning brought enormous prestige. Names such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides became famous throughout the Greek world because of these performances. Their stories continue to be staged today, a rather impressive achievement considering most of us struggle to remember what happened in last week's television series. Tragedies tackled difficult questions rather than offering simple answers. Kings destroyed themselves through pride. Heroes discovered that courage alone could not escape fate. Families were torn apart by revenge, while ordinary people struggled against the will of powerful gods. The audience laughed very little during these performances, but they thought deeply. Many Athenians believed great tragedy helped people examine their own lives and understand both human weakness and human greatness. Fortunately, not every performance required emotional devastation before lunchtime. After the tragedies came comedies, and the atmosphere changed completely. Playwrights such as Aristophanes delighted audiences with sharp political satire, ridiculous situations, exaggerated characters, and jokes aimed at some of Athens' most powerful citizens. Politicians, philosophers, military leaders, and even the public itself became targets. Imagine attending a national festival where your country's leaders were openly mocked before thousands of laughing spectators. Ancient Athenians considered that perfectly acceptable, provided the jokes were clever enough. Actors wore elaborate masks that allowed a small cast to portray many different characters. These masks featured exaggerated expressions, so even spectators sitting high above the stage could recognize whether a character was joyful, furious, terrified, or heartbroken. Combined with colourful costumes and powerful voices, they transformed simple performances into unforgettable experiences. By the festival's end, the winners earned lasting fame, but the audience carried home something even more valuable, stories that would be discussed for generations. Yet the celebrations did not end when the curtain fell. Outside the theatres, entire cities continued feasting, dancing, trading, and celebrating together in ways that made these festivals feel like the beating heart of the Greek world. When the final actors left the stage, and the last victorious athlete received his crown, the festival was far from over. In fact, for many ordinary Greeks, this was when the celebration truly came alive. Streets filled with laughter, Marketplaces remained crowded long after sunset, musicians played without pause, and families gathered around tables overflowing with food. The sacred ceremonies had honoured the gods, the competitions had crowned their champions, and now it was time for people themselves to celebrate. Every major festival transformed its host city into something resembling a giant open-air gathering. Temporary markets appeared almost overnight. Merchants arrived from every corner of the Greek world, carrying goods that many visitors had never seen before. Pottery from Corinth, fine olive oil from Attica, colourful textiles from Ionia, perfumes from the Eastern Mediterranean, bronze weapons, jewellery, carved statues, and exotic spices all competed for attention. Walking through these bustling streets was like visiting every Greek city at once without ever leaving the sanctuary. For traders, festivals were wonderful business opportunities. Thousands of visitors meant thousands of customers. Agreements were negotiated over cups of wine, craftsmen displayed their finest work, and travellers often returned home carrying gifts and souvenirs that reminded them of their journey. The gods may have inspired the gathering, but merchants certainly appreciated the crowds as well. Even in antiquity, someone always managed to discover that religious devotion and successful sales could comfortably coexist. Food became another centerpiece of the celebrations. Public feasts often followed religious sacrifices, allowing entire communities to share meals together. Long wooden tables filled with roasted meat, fresh bread, olives, cheese, figs, grapes, onions, fish, nuts, and honey cakes stretched across open courtyards. Wine flowed generously, although it was almost always mixed with water before drinking. Consuming unmixed wine was generally considered uncivilized behavior. The Greeks admired moderation, even if some festival guests occasionally interpreted moderation rather creatively by the end of the evening. Music rarely stopped for long. The gentle sound of lyres mixed with the lively melodies of the aulos, while singers entertained crowds gathered beneath colonnades and shaded courtyards. Soon dancing began. Greek dances varied from region to region, but many involved groups moving together in carefully practiced circles or lines. Men and women often danced separately depending on the occasion, while certain dances celebrated military victories, harvests, marriages, or religious devotion. Others were simply joyful expressions of community. Children eagerly copied the adults. Older generations offered advice that nobody had requested, and enthusiastic participants occasionally displayed far more confidence than rhythm. Some traditions appear to be wonderfully timeless. As darkness settled over the sanctuary, thousands of oil lamps illuminated temples, streets, and gathering places. Conversations continued deep into the night. Friends reunited after years apart. Philosophers debated difficult questions. Poets recited new verses, and strangers from distant cities discovered they shared far more than they had imagined. For a brief moment, political rivalries seemed less important than the simple pleasure of celebrating together. These festivals achieved something remarkable. They brought together people who spent much of the rest of the year separated by mountains, seas, and competing loyalties. And nowhere was that shared Greek identity displayed more clearly than at the other great Pan-Hellenic festivals, where every victory became a triumph, celebrated far beyond the city in which it was won. By the time the celebrations at Olympia came to an end, many travellers were already thinking about the next great gathering. The Olympic Games may have become the most famous festival in history, but they were only one part of a much larger tradition. Across ancient Greece, 4 major Pan-Hellenic festivals united the Greek world: the Olympic Games at Olympia, the Pythian Games at Delphi, the Nemean Games at Nemea, and the Isthmian Games near Corinth. Together they formed a cycle of celebrations that filled the calendar and gave athletes, musicians, and entire cities countless opportunities to earn lasting fame. The Nemean Games took place in the sanctuary of Zeus at Nemea, surrounded by peaceful valleys and vineyards. According to Greek mythology, the festival honoured the infant Opheltes, whose tragic death became part of the region's legendary history. Like Olympia, the games featured foot races, wrestling, boxing, pancration, and chariot racing. Victors received a simple crown woven from wild celery, a prize that sounds rather unusual today. Modern athletes generally dream of gold medals rather than decorative vegetables, but for the Greeks, the honour behind the crown mattered far more than the plant itself. Farther east, near the narrow isthmus of Corinth, stood another bustling sanctuary dedicated to Poseidon, god of the sea. The Isthmian Games reflected Corinth's position as one of Greece's busiest commercial cities. Ships from across the Mediterranean arrived nearby, bringing merchants, sailors, diplomats, and travellers from distant lands. During festival time, the sanctuary became an extraordinary meeting place where athletic contests blended naturally with business, diplomacy, and celebration. Because Corinth connected northern and southern Greece, visitors found it relatively easy to reach. Roads overflowed with travellers, while harbours filled with vessels carrying competitors eager to test themselves against the finest athletes of the Greek world. The prizes here usually took the form of crowns made from pine branches, although the true reward remained exactly the same as everywhere else: reputation. Winning at all 4 Pan-Hellenic festivals was exceptionally rare.